The sky cracked open with the burn of twilight as Helen stood on the marble balcony of the Spartan palace, her silhouette catching the golden kiss of the fading sun. The air was alive, humming with the faint echoes of her laughter from moments before. She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the cool stone, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as though even time itself paused to admire her. Every detail of her face, soft curves, eyes like the calm before a storm, lips that held the secrets of 1,000 unspoken thoughts, felt crafted by gods who knew the weight of perfection. Her beauty wasn't merely something to behold, it was a force. A silent tide that drew men closer, unable to resist, yet left them drowning in its wake. It was not kind. It was not gentle. It commanded attention like a storm over a restless sea, beautiful yet terrifying, promising wonder but never without consequence. In the shadows of the hall behind her, a servant watched in quiet awe, clutching the edge of her apron as if grounding herself from the spell that Helen cast effortlessly. She wasn't alone in this feeling, no one was immune. There was no escaping Helen, even if one tried. A glance, a whisper of her name, and the world changed. Men forgot their vows, women questioned their worth, and gods watched from Olympus with something akin to envy. Helen's beauty was more than skin, it was a prophecy that walked, breathed, and looked back at you with the faintest, almost cruel smile. To some, she was a gift of the heavens, to others, a curse too heavy for the mortal world. To herself? Even Helen wasn't sure. There were nights she stared into the still waters of the palace pools, seeing not a woman but a myth staring back. She reached out, tracing the reflection with her fingertips, and felt nothing. What did beauty mean when it stripped you of your humanity? Yet there was something else stirring in the depths of her heart that evening on the balcony. The winds carried whispers of a shift, of a choice she would soon make, or perhaps had already made. The silence around her wasn't stillness, it was tension, like the moment before a bowstring snaps. A chill ran through her as the sun dipped further, and the air thickened with a sense of inevitability. Even as the weight of her beauty pressed down on the world, it was Helen who bore the heaviest burden. Every gaze that lingered, every compliment that hung in the air like incense, every decision made on her behalf, they built an invisible chain around her, link by link. And yet, for all that the world demanded from her, it gave her no peace in return. From the streets of Sparta to the halls of far-off lands, the songs about her grew louder, wilder, and more dangerous with every passing day. Men argued in the agora about whether it was fair to say a woman's face could launch 1,000 ships. Fair? Fairness was never a part of Helen's story. In the quiet moments, she thought of her mother, Leda, a woman caught in Zeus's divine games and left to pick up the pieces. Leda had taught Helen to stand tall, to wear her beauty like armor, but even armor can crack under the right weight. Helen's beauty wasn't something she chose, it chose her. And now, it seemed, it was choosing for her again. Behind her, the distant clang of shields echoed through the palace corridors as soldiers trained in preparation for a conflict not yet named but already felt. The Spartans had always known war, but this would be different. It wasn't a fight for land, honor, or justice, it was a fight for Helen, and the irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Helen, the queen who didn't ask to be fought over. Helen, the woman who longed for something more than what her beauty dictated. Her fingers tightened against the balcony's edge as the first stars pierced the darkening sky. She closed her eyes and let the wind tangle in her hair, carrying whispers of faraway lands, unknown faces, and decisions that would soon define her. Somewhere out there, forces larger than herself were moving, pulling her into their web, and she could feel their grip tightening. The night grew darker, but Helen didn't retreat. She stood still, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faintest flicker of torches marked the edges of Sparta. Beneath the stars, her beauty was no longer dazzling, it was haunting. A reminder of everything gained and everything lost. Far beyond the city walls, a prince stirred in a foreign land, his dreams filled with visions of Helen. A ship was being prepared, its sails ready to carry promises, deceptions, and the spark of war. And Helen, though she didn't yet know it, had already begun her silent descent into history's fire. The air above the riverbank shimmered with a strange energy that made the earth itself seem to hold its breath. Leda, the queen of Sparta, stood by the water, her reflection rippling under the weight of a question she couldn't name. The soft breeze played with her hair, the kind of breeze that carried whispers of change. It was peaceful here, a brief reprieve from the demands of the court. But peace was often an illusion, and tonight it felt fragile, ready to shatter. From the heavens above, Zeus watched. He had been watching for days, weeks perhaps. Time didn't matter to the king of gods, only desire did. And in Leda, he saw something that stirred him, a mortal beauty so pure it seemed to defy the limits of humanity itself. But it wasn't just her beauty. It was her strength, her composure, her ability to walk among men and women as though she were carved from the same marble they revered in their temples. Zeus had always taken what he wanted, weaving destinies to fit his will, and tonight would be no different. The first sign of his arrival came as a sudden stillness, the breeze vanishing as if retreating from his presence. Leda looked up, her heart catching in her chest. There, descending from the sky, was a swan, its wings glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was unlike any creature she had ever seen, elegant, majestic, and radiating a power that made her skin prickle. The swan approached her, its movements impossibly graceful. Leda should have run, should have called for her guards, but something rooted her to the spot. It wasn't fear, nor was it curiosity. It was a force beyond her comprehension, a pull that made her feel both exposed and protected all at once. When the swan reached her, its eyes locked onto hers, and she knew in that moment that this was no ordinary creature. Zeus didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words, promises, and the inevitability of what was about to unfold. His touch, soft as feathers and yet heavy with intent, sealed her fate. It was over as quickly as it began, leaving Leda trembling by the riverbank, her reflection now blurred and unfamiliar. In the days that followed, Leda tried to make sense of what had happened. She told no one, not even her husband, King Tyndareus. How could she? How do you explain being chosen by a god, being swept into a story that wasn't yours to control? She carried the secret like a stone in her chest, even as her body began to change. The pregnancy was unlike anything she had ever known. There was no sickness, no fatigue, only a strange vitality that made her feel more alive than ever. When the time came, it wasn't a child that arrived first, but an egg, smooth and glistening like a pearl. The sight of it stole the breath from everyone present. It was unnatural, divine, and terrifying. When the egg finally cracked, the room fell silent. Out of the fragments emerged a baby girl, her skin glowing faintly as if kissed by the stars themselves. The midwives whispered prayers under their breath, their hands trembling as they wrapped the child in soft linens. Leda looked at her daughter, and for the first time in months, tears spilled down her cheeks. The baby's eyes were impossibly blue, deep and endless, like the heavens Zeus called home. Helen. That was the name Leda chose. It felt right, as though the gods themselves whispered it into her ear. And perhaps they had. The moment Helen was born, the air in the room grew lighter, the tension that had gripped everyone dissolving into something almost sacred. Yet even in that moment of awe, there was an unspoken fear that lingered. What did it mean to bring such a child into the world? Zeus, watching from Olympus, allowed himself a rare smile. Helen was his masterpiece, the culmination of his ambition and the embodiment of his power. She was a bridge between gods and mortals, a living reminder of his dominance over both realms. But Zeus knew that beauty of such magnitude came with a price. The world would not leave Helen in peace. She was born to be desired, fought over, and remembered for all time. Leda loved her daughter fiercely, but there were moments, quiet, stolen moments, when she looked at Helen and felt a pang of sorrow. The girl's beauty was undeniable, even as an infant. It shone like a beacon, drawing attention wherever she went. But Leda knew that beauty could be a weapon, and in the hands of the gods, it often was. The years passed, and Helen grew. With each passing day, her divine origins became more apparent. Animals seemed to calm in her presence, flowers bloomed more brightly where she walked. People couldn't help but stare, their admiration tinged with something darker, envy, longing, even fear. Helen herself remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her, her laughter ringing out like a song, innocent and pure. But storms cannot be held at bay forever. And for Helen, the storm would come sooner than anyone could have predicted. Even Zeus, in all his power, couldn't foresee the full extent of what he had set in motion. Helen was more than his daughter. She was a catalyst, a force of nature wrapped in mortal skin. She would unite nations, destroy cities, and reshape the course of history. The night after Helen's birth, Leda stood by her crib, watching her sleep. She reached out, brushing a soft curl from the baby's forehead, and whispered a prayer to the gods, not for blessings or favor, but for mercy. Deep down, she knew it was a prayer that would go unanswered. Helen's fate had already been written, and the ink was divine. The egg rested in a nest of silken cloth, its surface gleaming faintly under the pale light filtering through the palace windows. Leda's hands trembled as she touched it, her fingertips tracing the delicate, smooth shell. It was unlike anything mortal eyes had ever seen, larger than it should have been, its surface shimmering as though the stars themselves had been captured within. Around her, the room was silent, the midwives exchanging glances of confusion and fear. They had delivered many children, but this was beyond their understanding. Leda couldn't move at first. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. She had been preparing for a child, a baby she could cradle in her arms, not this strange and otherworldly creation. Yet, as foreign as the egg was, it felt deeply personal, as though it carried a piece of her soul and something far greater. The egg radiated warmth, not the kind of warmth that came from a fire, but a living, pulsing heat that seemed to breathe in harmony with her own heart. She pressed her palms against it, feeling the faintest vibration beneath the surface, as if something within was stirring, waiting. Her mind raced with questions she dared not speak aloud. What would emerge from this? Would it be human, God, or something in between? Days passed, and the egg became the center of Leda's world. The palace bustled with rumors. Servants whispered about the queen's divine encounter, speculating what Zeus' touch had truly left behind. Leda ignored them, devoting herself to the care of the egg, which seemed to respond to her attention. When she sang softly in the evenings, its glow brightened. When she placed her hands upon it, she could swear it moved, as if reassuring her it was alive. But reassurance came hand in hand with an unshakable dread. Leda was no fool, she knew how the gods worked. They did not give gifts without cost. The egg might have been a miracle, but miracles in the hands of gods often became curses. Still, she could not abandon it. A bond had formed between her and the life within, an unspoken promise that whatever came to pass, she would protect it. One night, the air in the palace shifted. It was subtle at first, a stillness that crept into the corridors like a warning. Leda sat by the egg, her fingers tracing patterns on its surface, when she felt it, a crack, small and almost imperceptible. Her breath hitched as she leaned closer, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the silence. Another crack appeared, then another, spreading like lightning across the shell. The room seemed to hold its breath, every sound muffled except for the faint, rhythmic tapping coming from within. Leda's hands hovered just above the egg, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold as it was meant to. The shell gave way with a sudden, sharp sound, fragments falling away like petals from a flower. And then, from the heart of the egg, she emerged. The baby girl was impossibly radiant, her skin glowing faintly as though kissed by the moon. Her tiny hands reached out instinctively, grasping at the air, and her eyes, deep, piercing blue, opened for the first time. Leda felt her breath leave her body as she gazed at the child, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of her presence. The midwives, who had been watching from a distance, fell to their knees, their voices trembling as they whispered prayers. This was no ordinary child. The air around her seemed charged, alive, as if the gods themselves were watching through the fabric of the heavens. Leda cradled the baby in her arms, her tears falling freely now. There was no fear, only an all-encompassing sense of awe and love. The child was warm, her small form fitting perfectly against Leda's chest, as if she had been waiting for this embrace. For the first time in weeks, Leda felt a glimmer of peace. But as the night wore on and the initial wonder faded, the questions returned, sharper than ever. What did it mean to hold a child born of Zeus? What kind of life awaited her? Leda stared at the sleeping infant, tracing the delicate features of her face, and felt a pang of sorrow. This child, so perfect, so innocent, was destined for a life that would not be her own. In the days that followed, the egg was forgotten, its shell scattered and discarded. But its legacy remained, woven into every breath the child took. She was named Helen, a name that came to Leda in a dream, whispered by a voice she did not recognize but trusted without question. It felt right, like the first note of a song that would echo across eternity. Helen grew quickly, her beauty blooming even in infancy. The servants adored her, the palace guards marveled at her, and strangers who caught glimpses of her could not look away. It was as though the world itself bent to accommodate her presence. Yet Leda watched with quiet unease. She saw the way people changed around Helen, how their admiration teetered on the edge of obsession. The egg was gone, but its power lingered in every step Helen took, every laugh that spilled from her lips. It was a reminder that she was not entirely of this world, that her existence carried the weight of divine intention. Leda knew better than anyone that gifts from the gods were rarely what they seemed. And far away, high on Mount Olympus, Zeus watched with satisfaction. His daughter had been born, her destiny set in motion. The world would come to know her name, to celebrate her beauty, and to curse it. For in that moment of divine ambition, Zeus had created not just a child, but a force that would shape the fates of gods and men alike. Leda sat by the edge of the palace garden, her fingers brushing absent-mindedly against the petals of a white rose. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the courtyard, but her thoughts were far from the tranquil beauty around her. Her gaze lingered on the stone pathway where Helen had just walked moments ago, her laughter still echoing faintly in the air. Leda closed her eyes, her heart heavy with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Helen was her daughter, but she wasn't entirely hers, was she? Leda had always been a woman of grace, her beauty renowned throughout Sparta and beyond. Men spoke of her as though she were a goddess herself, their words heavy with admiration and longing. But Leda had learned early that beauty was not a gift, it was a trap. It drew people in, but it also chained her to expectations and desires that were not her own. She had hoped to shield her children from this burden, to raise them in a world where they could be free of the weight she carried. Yet Helen was born to a different fate. Leda remembered the day Zeus came to her, disguised as a swan, his divine presence filling the air with a palpable energy that left her breathless. She had felt powerless in his grasp, a mortal caught in the games of gods. And now, years later, the legacy of that encounter had taken shape in the form of Helen, a child so breathtakingly beautiful that even the sun seemed to shine differently on her. Leda often wondered how much of Helen's destiny had been written the moment Zeus laid his eyes on her. Was her daughter merely a pawn in the plans of the gods, or was there something more? Leda had seen the way people looked at Helen, their admiration turning into something almost dangerous. She feared for her daughter, knowing the world would never allow her to live an ordinary life. In Helen's beauty, Leda saw a reflection of her own, magnified to a degree that was almost otherworldly. It wasn't just her face, her flawless features, or her luminous presence, it was the way people responded to her, the way their hearts seemed to bend toward her like flowers seeking the sun. Leda understood that this kind of beauty came at a cost. It was a force, a power, and it demanded a price. Her other children were not untouched by this legacy either. Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, were strong and noble, their bond unbreakable. But even they could not escape the whispers that followed Helen. Clytemnestra, fierce and determined, carried her own burdens, often overshadowed by her sister's brilliance. Leda's children were woven into a tapestry that stretched far beyond the walls of Sparta, their fates intertwined with forces they could not control. Late at night, when the palace was quiet and the world seemed still, Leda would sit by Helen's bedside, watching her sleep. Her daughter's face was serene, untouched by the worries that plagued Leda's heart. In those moments, Leda allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where Helen could grow up free of the burdens her beauty imposed. But the world was not kind to those who stood out, and Leda knew that Helen's life would be anything but peaceful. The gods had given Helen a gift, but they had also cursed her with it. Leda had seen it in the way men spoke of her, their words tinged with obsession. She had seen it in the way women envied her, their jealousy bubbling just beneath the surface. Helen's beauty was a double-edged sword, and it was only a matter of time before it drew blood. Leda carried her own guilt, though she never spoke of it. She had allowed Zeus into her life, and in doing so, she had set these events into motion. Was it fair to blame herself for what followed? She didn't know. All she knew was that she loved Helen fiercely, with a protective instinct that sometimes felt futile against the forces that surrounded them. As the years passed, Leda watched Helen grow into a woman who carried her beauty with grace, but also a quiet sadness. Helen didn't speak of it, but Leda could see the weight it placed on her. The glances, the whispers, the constant attention, it was a prison of its own, one Helen could never escape. Leda tried to offer guidance, to teach her daughter how to navigate a world that would never truly understand her. But there were limits to what she could do. In her quieter moments, Leda thought of Zeus, of the night by the riverbank when her life had been forever changed. She wondered if he ever thought of Helen, if he watched from Olympus as his daughter's life unfolded. Did he feel pride, or was he indifferent, caught up in his own divine machinations? Leda's legacy was not her own. It was woven into the lives of her children, into the choices they would make and the paths they would follow. She had given birth to a daughter who would be remembered for all time, but she couldn't help wishing that Helen could have been remembered for more than her beauty. The garden grew quieter as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the stone pathway. Leda rose slowly, her fingers brushing the petals of the rose one last time before she turned toward the palace. Helen's laughter echoed faintly once more, a reminder of the light she brought into the world. But Leda knew that light would cast long shadows, and those shadows would follow Helen wherever she went. As she stepped inside, the weight of her legacy settled on her shoulders, heavier than ever. The first light of dawn often found Helen playing in the palace courtyard, her laughter like the delicate notes of a lyre carried on the morning breeze. Even as a child, she seemed to belong to a world apart, a creature of sunlight and wonder who moved with an unknowing grace that left those around her mesmerized. Servants paused in their tasks to watch her, their hands stilling as they marveled at her radiant beauty, even then so evident. Helen had a way of drawing attention without trying, her every movement like poetry in motion. Her hair, golden and soft, shimmered in the light as though it had been spun from threads of the sun. Her eyes, a piercing blue, held a depth that seemed beyond her years, reflecting a spark of the divine from which she had sprung. But for all her beauty, Helen was still a child. She ran barefoot through the palace gardens, her feet kicking up dust and her voice ringing out in playful shouts. She climbed trees with her brothers, Castor and Pollux, her laughter mixing with theirs as they challenged one another to greater heights. The bond between them was unbreakable in those early years, their differences forgotten in the innocence of youth. Clytemnestra, her elder sister, often looked after Helen with a protective fierceness that softened only for her. Though they were opposites in many ways, there was a mutual respect that bound them together. Clytemnestra, with her dark eyes and resolute spirit, was a shield against the whispers that began to follow Helen even as a child. The palace of Sparta was a world of its own, filled with life and activity. Soldiers trained in the courtyards, their shouts echoing against the stone walls. Markets bustled with merchants selling wares from far-off lands, the air thick with the scent of spices and leather. Yet amidst all this, Helen's presence stood out, a beacon of light that drew the gaze of everyone she passed. Leda watched her daughter closely during these years, her heart swelling with pride, but also tightening with a mother's worry. Helen's beauty was already a source of fascination, even among children her own age. At festivals and feasts, young boys tripped over their words around her, their faces flushed with admiration they didn't yet understand. Young girls stared, a mixture of awe and envy flickering in their eyes. Helen, however, remained blissfully unaware. She played with the same unguarded joy as any other child, chasing butterflies in the gardens and weaving flower crowns for her family. She didn't yet understand the effect she had on others, the way her presence seemed to change the air around her. But Leda saw it. She saw how grown men paused in their conversations to watch Helen walk by, their eyes lingering too long. She noticed the way women whispered behind their hands, their voices tinged with something darker than admiration. Leda knew what beauty could do, how it could inspire devotion, but also jealousy and resentment. She worried for Helen, though she kept those fears hidden behind a composed facade. The first hint of Helen's divine nature came one summer afternoon when she was just a small child. The palace courtyard was alive with activity, the air filled with the shouts of soldiers and the chatter of merchants. Helen had wandered off to the stables, drawn by her love of animals. When the servants found her, she was seated on the ground, her tiny hands resting gently on the muzzle of a restless stallion. The horse, known for its temper, stood perfectly still, its massive body relaxed as though soothed by an unseen force. The stablemaster stared in disbelief, his voice shaking as he called for Leda. When Leda arrived, she found Helen laughing softly, the stallion's dark eyes fixed on her as if in a trance. Leda's heart clenched at the sight, the realization sinking in that her daughter was not entirely mortal. It wasn't just her beauty that set her apart, it was something deeper, something divine that radiated from within. As Helen grew, so too did the attention she garnered. Visitors to the palace brought gifts for her, their motives veiled but unmistakable. Poets began to compose verses in her honor, their words attempting to capture a beauty that defied description. Even the gods seemed to take notice, though they remained silent, their presence felt only in the subtle shifts of fate that surrounded her. Helen, for her part, remained a child at heart, her world defined by simple joys. She loved the feeling of the wind in her hair as she ran through the fields, the taste of honey cakes fresh from the oven, the warmth of her mother's embrace at the end of the day. She didn't yet understand the weight of the expectations placed upon her, the destiny that waited just beyond the horizon. Leda often lay awake at night, her thoughts consumed by what the future might hold. She wanted to shield Helen, to keep her safe from the world that would inevitably claim her. But deep down, Leda knew she could not fight fate. Helen was born of Zeus, her existence a thread in a tapestry woven by the gods themselves. The years of Helen's childhood were fleeting, a brief and fragile moment of peace before the storm. Leda cherished every smile, every laugh, every innocent question Helen asked about the world. She knew these moments would not last, that the beauty her daughter carried would one day become both a gift and a curse. And so, as Helen slept each night, her small form curled beneath a blanket of stars, Leda whispered prayers to the heavens. Not for glory or greatness, but for her daughter's happiness. It was a wish as fragile as the petals of a rose, but it was all she had to offer. Helen stood by the reflective pool in the palace gardens, her eyes fixed on the water's surface. She leaned closer, the delicate features of her face mirrored in the gentle ripples. The sun caught her golden hair, setting it ablaze with light, and her deep blue eyes, like fragments of a summer sky, stared back at her. She frowned slightly, brushing her hand across her face as if to erase the image. It wasn't the first time Helen had felt the weight of her reflection. As a child, she had loved her mirror image, treating it like a friend, laughing and playing as though the girl looking back was her twin. But as she grew, her reflection had become something else, a reminder of the way people looked at her, the way they whispered her name as if it were a spell. Her beauty was undeniable, extraordinary even, and she knew it. Everyone around her made sure of that. They told her with their words, their stares, and their gestures. Strangers stopped in the streets when she passed. Women would glance at her with awe or envy, their expressions shifting from admiration to resentment in the blink of an eye. Men's gazes lingered, filled with a hunger that Helen didn't fully understand but instinctively recoiled from. It was exhausting, being seen so much. She felt as though her beauty was a flame, and the world was constantly trying to draw warmth from it. Yet in doing so, it burned her, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She had become a thing to be admired, desired, even worshipped, but rarely understood. Helen often sought refuge in the solitude of the palace gardens, where she could let the mask of perfection slip away. Here, among the flowers and the soft hum of bees, she could be something closer to herself. But even the gardens held shadows. She remembered the day a servant's son had followed her here, his eyes wide and his face flushed as he stammered out a confession of love. Helen had been kind, trying to let him down gently, but the boy had left in tears. Later, his mother had scolded her in hushed tones, blaming Helen for leading him on, though she had done nothing. It was always like this. Her beauty was treated as both a gift and a weapon, something to admire, but also something to blame. She couldn't win. If she smiled, it was an invitation. If she didn't, she was cold and unfeeling. Helen began to realize that her beauty was not just her own, it belonged to everyone who looked at her. And in their eyes, it defined her completely. The suitors came soon after, drawn from far and wide by tales of her radiance. Kings, princes, and warriors arrived at the gates of Sparta, each more determined than the last to win her hand. They brought treasures, gold, jewels, silks, and perfumes. They composed songs in her honor, swearing oaths of undying love and loyalty. But Helen saw through their gestures. Most of them didn't even know her. How could they? They were in love with an idea, a myth, a vision of perfection that had little to do with who she really was. She felt trapped, suffocated by their attention, their relentless pursuit. Even as they spoke of love, she could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, as if her beauty obligated her to choose one of them, to fulfill their dreams. Her father, Tyndareus, was overwhelmed by the chaos her beauty had caused. He called a council to decide her fate, worried that the competition for her hand would lead to war. And Helen, still so young, watched from the shadows as the men around her debated her future as though she were a prize to be claimed. She wanted to scream, to tell them that she wasn't just a face, a body, a thing to be possessed. She wanted to remind them that she had thoughts, dreams, fears, that she was more than the image they saw. But no one would have listened. They didn't want Helen the person, they wanted Helen the ideal. Helen often wondered if her beauty was a punishment. The gods had given her this gift, but it didn't feel like a gift at all. It felt like chains, binding her to a destiny she hadn't chosen. She envied her sisters, who could walk through the palace without turning heads, who could live their lives without the constant gaze of the world upon them. She remembered her mother, Leda, holding her close one night as she cried, her tears soaking into the silk of her mother's gown. Leda had stroked her hair, her voice soft and steady as she said, "Your beauty is a force, Helen. It will inspire greatness, but it will also bring pain. You must learn to carry it, or it will crush you." Helen carried those words with her, though they offered little comfort. She didn't want to be a force. She didn't want to inspire greatness or pain. She just wanted to live, to be seen for who she was and not what she looked like. But the world wouldn't allow it. As Helen stood by the pool, her reflection staring back at her, she felt the familiar ache in her chest. It wasn't just sadness, it was frustration, anger, and longing all mixed together. She traced a finger across the water's surface, distorting her image until it disappeared. But even as she tried to erase it, Helen knew her beauty would always follow her. It was a part of her, as inseparable as her shadow. And though she tried to find moments of peace, she couldn't escape the feeling that her life was no longer her own. Somewhere in the distance, a dove cooed softly, its wings fluttering as it took flight. Helen watched it disappear into the sky, her heart heavy with the realization that she would never know such freedom. Her beauty was her cage, and the world held the key. The sun hung low over the Spartan plains, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson. Helen strolled near the palace gardens, her thoughts drifting like the soft breeze that played with her golden hair. She was a vision of youth, her beauty radiating an unearthly glow even in the fading light. Yet, in this moment of solitude, she felt free from the weight of the gazes and expectations that usually surrounded her. That fleeting peace shattered without warning. A hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her startled scream, and an arm wrapped tightly around her waist. She struggled, her heart pounding as she twisted to see her captor. It was a man, a tall, powerful figure with piercing eyes that burned with determination. She recognized him instantly, Theseus, the famed hero of Athens, a warrior of great renown. Helen's blood ran cold. The stories of Theseus were well known, tales of his bravery and strength. But this wasn't a hero standing before her, it was a predator. His expression was resolute, his grip unyielding as he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward a waiting chariot hidden beyond the palace walls. Panic surged through Helen's veins. She thrashed and kicked, her voice muffled by the strength of his hold. Yet for all her efforts, Theseus moved with a confidence that betrayed no doubt or hesitation. He had planned this, and no amount of struggle would deter him. The chariot sped away from Sparta, the horses galloping at a furious pace. Helen's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. Why her? Why now? Theseus had no claim on her, no right to take her from her home. Yet his silence was deafening, his focus fixed on the road ahead as if her protests were nothing more than the wind in his ears. When they finally stopped, night had fallen, the landscape shrouded in darkness. Theseus led her to a secluded grove, its ancient trees casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. He released her, and Helen stumbled back, her chest heaving as she glared at him with a mix of fear and fury. "Why have you done this?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite the steel she tried to summon. Theseus regarded her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Because you are meant for greatness, Helen. Your beauty is unparalleled, your blood divine. You deserve more than to be a pawn in the games of lesser men. You deserve to stand beside someone who can match your worth." His words struck her like a blow, their arrogance stoking the fire of her anger. "And you think you are that someone?" she spat, her voice sharp with defiance. "You think stealing me from my home gives you the right to decide my fate?" Theseus stepped closer, his presence looming. "I see beyond what others see. You are not just a mortal woman, Helen. You are a legacy, a force that can shape the world. Together, we could." "Enough." Helen's voice cut through the night, her eyes blazing. She stepped back, her hands clenched into fists. "You speak of greatness, yet you act like a thief. You talk of worth, yet you treat me like a prize to be claimed. You are no better than the others." Her words seemed to pierce Theseus's composure, his jaw tightening as he looked at her. For a moment, the confident hero faltered, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a resolve that chilled her to the core. "You'll see, in time," he said quietly. "You'll understand." The days that followed blurred into a haze of fear and frustration. Theseus kept her in the grove, far from prying eyes, determined to win her over. He spoke of destiny and power, of a life where she wouldn't be shackled by the expectations of others. But Helen heard none of it. She saw only the man who had stolen her freedom, who had reduced her to a captive under the guise of offering her a brighter future. Yet Helen was not without hope. She was clever, her mind as sharp as any sword. She began to observe Theseus, noting his routines, his moments of distraction. She spoke carefully, choosing her words to plant seeds of doubt and unease. One evening, as Theseus tended to the fire, Helen made her move. Feigning exhaustion, she waited until his guard was lowered. With a sudden burst of strength, she fled into the woods, her heart pounding as she ran through the darkness. Her freedom was short-lived. Theseus caught up to her quickly, his strength overpowering her once more. But in her defiance, Helen's spirit burned brighter than ever. She refused to yield, her struggles a testament to the fire that lived within her. It was in this moment of chaos that the gods intervened. A sudden gust of wind tore through the grove, extinguishing the fire and plunging the world into darkness. The sound of thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous warning. Theseus froze, his grip on Helen loosening as he looked to the sky. Helen felt it too, a presence, powerful and undeniable. The air crackled with energy, a reminder that the divine watched over her. Theseus hesitated, his confidence wavering as he realized that even a hero was not beyond the reach of the gods. And in that hesitation, Helen saw her chance. Though she couldn't escape that night, she knew her fight was far from over. Her spirit remained unbroken, her will unyielding. She was no mere prize, no passive figure in the games of men and gods. As the storm loomed overhead, Helen vowed to reclaim her freedom, to defy the forces that sought to control her. Her beauty may have been her curse, but her spirit was her strength. And it was a strength that no one, not even Theseus, could take from her. The great hall of Sparta had never seen such a gathering. The air buzzed with tension, excitement, and the subtle hum of competition. Men of power and prestige from across the known world had arrived, each determined to stake his claim for the hand of Helen. Warriors in gleaming armor, kings draped in finery, and princes with eyes alight with ambition, all stood side by side, their hearts set on winning the most coveted prize in existence. Helen watched from behind a veil, hidden from the eager eyes that sought her. She had been seated in the upper gallery, where she could observe the spectacle without being part of it. Her father, Tyndareus, stood at the center of the hall, his expression a mix of pride and worry. Though he was the king, the sheer scale of what Helen's beauty had unleashed was beyond his control. Each suitor brought with him gifts, each more extravagant than the last. Chests of gold and silver spilled their riches onto the stone floor. Intricately crafted weapons gleamed in the torchlight. Exotic animals, their leashes held by nervous handlers, growled and paced restlessly. Some had even composed poetry, their voices trembling with emotion as they recited lines extolling Helen's virtues. But Helen felt no pride, no flattery. She saw only desperation and arrogance, a room filled with men who saw her as a trophy rather than a person. Their words were hollow, their offerings devoid of true meaning. She felt trapped, suffocated by their gaze, even as she remained hidden. In the days leading up to this event, Helen had argued with her father. "Why must I marry now?" she had pleaded. "Why must I choose one of them?" Tyndareus had sighed heavily, his shoulders weighed down by a burden he couldn't share. "You are too beautiful, Helen," he had said, the words more curse than compliment. "If I delay, these men will turn their swords on each other, and on us. This is not just about marriage. It is about peace." Peace. The word tasted bitter on Helen's tongue now. Was peace worth sacrificing her freedom, her happiness? The answer, it seemed, didn't matter. The world had already decided that her life was not her own. As the evening wore on, the suitors grew restless. The air thickened with the undercurrent of rivalry, each man eager to prove himself the most worthy. It was then that Tyndareus raised his hand, silencing the murmurs with a single gesture. "I cannot deny that my daughter's beauty is a blessing and a burden," he began, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "To choose one of you would be to invite the wrath of the others. Therefore, I propose a solution that will bind you all in loyalty and ensure the safety of my house." The hall erupted in whispers. What solution could possibly satisfy them all? Tyndareus continued, "Each of you will swear an oath, a sacred bond. You will pledge to defend the man who wins Helen's hand, to protect their union and support him against any who seek to tear them apart. Only once this oath is made will I allow my daughter to choose her husband." The suitors exchanged uneasy glances. It was a bold move, one that forced them to acknowledge the power of the gods and the gravity of their desires. To break such an oath would invite divine punishment, a risk none could afford to take. One by one, they stepped forward, each man swearing the oath before the gods and the gathered assembly. Their voices rang out, filled with determination and, perhaps, a touch of fear. Helen listened from her hidden perch, her heart heavy. This was not freedom. This was not choice. It was another cage, gilded and polished, but a cage nonetheless. When the last oath had been sworn, Tyndareus called Helen to the hall. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her veil still drawn as she descended the staircase. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her as though the very air depended on her presence. She stopped before her father, lifting her veil to reveal the face that had drawn kings and warriors to their knees. There was an audible gasp, a ripple of awe that swept through the hall like a wave. But Helen barely noticed. Her gaze was steady, her heart steeled against the weight of their admiration. "You may choose," Tyndareus said softly, his voice meant only for her ears. Helen's eyes swept over the crowd. It didn't matter whom she chose, she already knew her life would not be her own. But if she had to surrender her freedom, she would do so on her terms. She would choose someone who could at least provide her with a semblance of stability, someone who might understand the storm that came with her beauty. Her gaze settled on Menelaus. He was not the most handsome, nor the most extravagant in his offerings, but there was something in his demeanor that set him apart. He was steady, his confidence quiet but firm. Helen didn't love him, she doubted she ever could, but in this moment, she chose him, if only because he seemed the least likely to treat her as a prize to be flaunted. "I choose Menelaus," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The room erupted in applause and murmurs, some voices triumphant, others resigned. Menelaus stepped forward, bowing deeply before Helen, his face a mixture of pride and humility. And just like that, her fate was sealed. As the night wore on and the festivities began, Helen retreated to the shadows once more. She felt the weight of her choice settle over her, an invisible crown that pressed against her temples. The men laughed and drank, their oaths already forgotten in the haze of celebration. But Helen knew better. She could feel the undercurrents of tension, the envy that lingered in the air. This was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The gods had been invoked, and their gaze now rested heavily upon her. Somewhere deep within her, a sense of foreboding stirred. The suitors had sworn to protect her union, but Helen could feel the fragile threads of their promises fraying already. War had not come yet, but she could hear its distant drumbeat, faint but unrelenting. The curse of her beauty had claimed its next victim, peace itself. The grand hall of Sparta was adorned with opulence befitting the marriage of a king and the most beautiful woman in the world. Golden tapestries embroidered with scenes of victory and divine favor hung from the high walls, while fragrant garlands of myrtle and roses draped every column. Musicians played soft, lilting tunes that blended with the hum of anticipation among the gathered nobles. Yet for all its grandeur, the room felt stifling to Helen, its splendor a gilded cage that seemed to tighten around her with every passing moment. She sat motionless, a vision in silken robes of white and gold that shimmered like sunlight on water. Jewels adorned her hair, catching the torchlight and flashes of brilliance, but Helen felt none of the radiance they cast. She glanced briefly at her reflection in a polished silver platter, her face calm and serene as befitting a bride, but her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. The weight of the ceremony, the significance of her choice, bore down on her shoulders like an invisible shroud. Across the room, Menelaus stood among his kin, his posture proud yet tempered with restraint. His gaze sought Helen's, but she avoided his eyes, focusing instead on the intricate patterns of the mosaic floor. He had been gracious in his courtship, careful to treat her with a respect she hadn't often encountered among men. Still, Helen's heart remained distant, her emotions tangled in a web of duty, resignation, and an unspoken yearning for something she could not name. The ceremony began with solemn chants, the high priest invoking the gods to bless the union. Helen and Menelaus were led to the central altar, where a sacred flame burned in honor of Hera, goddess of marriage. The flames danced, their flickering light casting strange, shifting shadows on the faces of the gathered crowd. As the priest recited the ancient rites, Helen felt a pang of unease, as though the gods themselves were watching with bated breath. When it was time for the vows, Menelaus turned to her, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "Helen, you are the most extraordinary gift the gods have bestowed upon this earth. I pledge to honor you, to protect you, and to rule by your side with wisdom and strength." The hall erupted in applause at his words, the crowd's approval echoing against the stone walls. But Helen barely heard them. Her own vow came next, and as she spoke the prescribed words, she felt as though they belonged to someone else. "I pledge my loyalty to you, Menelaus, as your wife and queen, and I will uphold the honor of Sparta by your side." The words fell from her lips with practiced grace, but her heart was silent. The feast that followed was a blur of laughter, music, and indulgence. Cups overflowed with wine, and the tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, honey cakes, and delicacies brought from distant lands. Nobles toasted the happy couple, their voices loud with cheer and congratulations. Helen smiled when custom demanded it, her beauty dazzling all who looked upon her, but her mind wandered far from the revelry. As the night deepened, Menelaus approached her. His smile was warm, his manner gentle as he extended a hand to her. "Shall we dance, my queen?" he asked, his tone inviting but not insistent. Helen hesitated, but there was no room for refusal. She placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the center of the hall where the musicians struck up a soft, melodic tune. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the couple as they moved together, their steps perfectly in sync. Helen's movements were graceful, her smile composed, yet she felt every pair of eyes upon her like a weight. "Are you happy, Helen?" Menelaus asked softly, his voice barely audible over the music. The question caught her off guard. She looked up at him, her gaze searching his face for signs of malice or arrogance, but finding none. There was only sincerity, an earnestness that seemed to plead for an answer she couldn't give. "I am content," she replied, her voice measured. Menelaus studied her, his expression unreadable, but he didn't press her further. They finished the dance in silence, the crowd erupting in cheers as they stepped apart. Helen returned to her seat, her thoughts churning as the night wore on. As the revelry finally drew to a close, the guests departed, leaving Helen and Menelaus alone in their chamber. The room was adorned with soft candlelight and fragrant blossoms, a setting meant to evoke intimacy and love. Menelaus approached her, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he understood the weight of the moment. "Helen," he said, his voice low and gentle, "I know this marriage was not of your choosing, but I hope, in time, we can find happiness together. I will not rush you or demand what you cannot give." His words, so unexpected in their kindness, brought a lump to Helen's throat. She had steeled herself for domination, for the cold, possessive grip she had come to expect from men who saw her only as an object of desire. Instead, Menelaus offered patience, a glimmer of understanding that softened her heart, if only slightly. She nodded, unable to find the words to respond, and Menelaus took her hand briefly, pressing it to his chest in a gesture of sincerity before stepping back. He left her to her thoughts, retreating to the far side of the chamber, where the night's quiet eventually enveloped them both. As Helen lay awake, staring at the ornate carvings on the ceiling, a single tear slid down her cheek. This was her life now, bound by oaths and expectations, her freedom surrendered to the tides of fate. Menelaus might be a kinder man than most, but he could not change the truth of what she had lost. Yet even as the chamber fell silent, Helen felt the stirring of something beyond the walls, beyond the reach of mortal hands. The gods had not finished with her. This was merely the beginning, and the shadow of destiny loomed larger than ever. Sparta was a land of contradictions, beautiful and severe, rich in tradition yet governed by unyielding discipline. Nestled in the fertile valley of the Eurotas River, its fields stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed perpetually ablaze with sunlight. Majestic mountains framed the horizon, their peaks shrouded in mist that whispered of ancient gods and timeless secrets. The landscape was breathtaking, a vivid contrast to the rigid lives of those who inhabited it. For Helen, life in Sparta was a delicate dance between freedom and confinement. As queen, she was revered, her beauty a symbol of the city's pride and divine favor. But that reverence came at a cost. Her every step was watched, her every word weighed, her very existence a spectacle for others to admire or envy. The palace was a marvel of Spartan austerity. Its stone walls stood firm and imposing, built more for function than grandeur. Unlike the opulent courts of Mycenae or Crete, Spartan nobility valued simplicity and strength over decadence. Yet, Helen's quarters were a notable exception. Menelaus had ensured that her chambers were adorned with touches of elegance, soft tapestries, delicate carvings, and vibrant flowers brought in from distant lands. These gestures of beauty felt like a balm, a small rebellion against the starkness of Spartan life. Her days followed a predictable rhythm. The mornings began early, with the palace slowly coming alive to the sounds of servants and guards. Helen would often sit by the window, watching the sun rise over the distant hills. It was her moment of solitude, a brief escape from the ceaseless expectations that awaited her. The court was an unrelenting theater of diplomacy and ceremony. Helen attended meetings with Menelaus, her presence a reminder of Sparta's divine favor. Though she rarely spoke, her silence carried a power of its own. Her beauty was a weapon, wielded by others to secure alliances and intimidate rivals. Yet, behind the serene mask she wore, Helen felt a growing unease. She yearned to be more than an ornament, more than a pawn in the endless games of men. The women of Sparta were unlike any Helen had encountered before. Strong, confident, and outspoken, they moved with an ease that bordered on defiance. They trained alongside the men, their bodies honed for resilience and endurance. Spartan women were not confined to the domestic sphere as in other cities. They wielded influence, commanded respect, and spoke their minds without fear. Helen admired their strength, though it often felt at odds with her own experience. She was a queen, yet her beauty and lineage defined her more than her intellect or will. When she walked among the Spartan women, she felt their curiosity, even their judgment. Some whispered in admiration, others in suspicion. To them, she was an outsider, a goddess-made woman whose presence disrupted the natural order. There were moments of quiet joy, fleeting as they were. Helen loved the orchards beyond the palace, where she could lose herself among the rows of olive trees and vines heavy with grapes. She would walk for hours, her bare feet brushing against the earth, the sun warming her skin. In those moments, she felt closer to something real, something untainted by the expectations of others. Menelaus was attentive but distant, his time consumed by the affairs of state. He treated Helen with respect, his affection measured and deliberate. At times, she caught glimpses of vulnerability in him, a softening of his voice, a lingering glance when he thought she wasn't looking. He wanted to understand her, perhaps even love her, but Helen kept her heart carefully guarded. She was grateful for his kindness, yet her soul remained restless, yearning for something she couldn't name. The people of Sparta revered Helen as a symbol of divine grace, yet their adoration often felt like a burden. When she walked through the city, children would stop and stare, their parents bowing deeply in respect. Merchants would offer her their finest goods, craftsmen their most exquisite creations. She smiled politely, thanked them with practiced grace, but each encounter left her feeling more isolated. At night, the city grew quiet, the harsh discipline of Spartan life giving way to the soft hum of crickets and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. Helen would sit on the balcony, gazing at the stars. She often thought of her mother, Leda, and the strange, otherworldly circumstances of her own birth. She wondered if the gods watched her still, their amusement at her life an endless source of divine entertainment. The monotony of life in Sparta weighed heavily on her, yet Helen found ways to endure. She took solace in the small freedoms she could carve out, a stolen moment in the gardens, a whispered conversation with a trusted servant, the quiet companionship of her thoughts. But deep down, she knew that this life, no matter how stable or gilded, was not hers to claim. The winds over Sparta carried whispers of change, faint yet persistent. Travelers spoke of unrest in distant lands, of kingdoms on the brink of conflict. Helen sensed the storm brewing, its approach inevitable. She felt it in the uneasy glances of the courtiers and the subtle shifts in Menelaus's demeanor. She didn't yet know what form it would take, but she knew it would find her. It always did. Her beauty, her fate, her very existence seemed destined to stir the world into chaos. And though she lived within the sturdy walls of Sparta, surrounded by order and strength, Helen understood one unshakable truth: the gods were not finished with her. The winds over Mount Ida were cool and restless, carrying with them the scent of pine and the faint murmur of the gods. Paris, a shepherd by choice but a prince by birth, stood in the shadow of an ancient oak, his flock grazing lazily on the rolling hills below. His days were simple, unmarked by the intrigues of the royal court he had forsaken. Yet on this day, the quiet rhythm of his life shattered like glass under the weight of divine will. The three goddesses appeared before him without warning. Hera, queen of the heavens, stood tall and imperious, her golden crown catching the sunlight as if it had been forged by the sun itself. Beside her, Athena, clad in gleaming armor, exuded a fierce, unrelenting power that seemed to challenge the earth beneath her feet. And then there was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, whose beauty seemed to soften the very air around her, making it warm and intoxicating. Paris blinked, struggling to comprehend the majesty before him. These were not mortal women. Their presence altered the fabric of reality, bending it to their will. His heart pounded in his chest as he dropped to his knees, his head bowed low. "Rise, mortal," Hera commanded, her voice echoing like thunder across the hills. "We have come to test you." Paris lifted his gaze, his confusion evident. "Test me," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What could the gods possibly seek from me?" Athena stepped forward, her piercing gray eyes locking onto his. "You have been chosen to judge a matter of great importance," she said, her tone edged with challenge. "You will decide which of us is the most deserving of this prize." From the folds of her robe, Hera produced a golden apple, its surface inscribed with the words "for the fairest." It gleamed with an otherworldly light, as though it held the secrets of the cosmos within its perfect form. Paris stared at the apple, the enormity of the task dawning on him. To judge the gods themselves? To choose between their rivalries, knowing the weight of their wrath or favor could shape his destiny? The thought was almost paralyzing. Hera was the first to speak, her voice laced with the authority of a queen. "Choose me, Paris, and I will grant you power beyond your wildest dreams. You will rule over vast lands, your kingdom stretching farther than the eye can see. No man will dare challenge your reign." Paris glanced at her, the promise of dominion glinting like a blade in the sunlight. But before he could respond, Athena stepped forward, her words sharp and unyielding. "Choose me," she said, her voice steady, "and I will make you the greatest warrior the world has ever known. Your name will echo through the ages, sung in triumph and fear. No enemy will stand against you, and you will be revered as a legend." Her words stirred something primal within him, a spark of ambition and pride. Yet even as her promise lingered in the air, Aphrodite stepped closer, her movements as fluid as water. She smiled, her lips curving with an allure that felt almost dangerous. "Paris," she murmured, her voice a melody that seemed to resonate in his very bones, "choose me, and I will give you what your heart truly desires, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. A love so profound, so consuming, it will make the heavens envious." At her words, the world seemed to hold its breath. Paris felt his resolve waver, his thoughts a storm of longing and fear. Power and glory were formidable temptations, but love? Love had always been the one thing he had yearned for, the one thing that had eluded him in the quiet solitude of his life as a shepherd. The goddesses watched him closely, their gazes like fire, ice, and silk. He knew that no choice would come without consequence. To favor one goddess was to earn the enmity of the others, their vengeance as inevitable as the turning of the stars. But the allure of Aphrodite's promise was too great. The vision she conjured, of a woman whose beauty rivaled the dawn, whose love would fill the void in his soul, was irresistible. With trembling hands, Paris reached for the golden apple. He held it aloft and turned to Aphrodite, his voice steady despite the whirlwind within him. "I choose you." The reaction was immediate. Hera's face darkened with fury, the air around her crackling with suppressed power. Athena's lips curled into a cold smile, her eyes flashing with disdain. They said nothing, but their wrath hung heavy in the air, an unspoken vow that their anger would not be forgotten. Aphrodite, however, stepped forward, her expression radiant. She placed a hand on Paris's cheek, her touch like a whisper of summer wind. "You have chosen wisely," she said, her voice soft but triumphant. "I will keep my promise, Paris. You will have the love of Helen of Sparta, the most beautiful woman in the world." At her words, a chill ran through him. Helen of Sparta, the name was like a distant echo in his mind, familiar yet foreign. He had heard tales of her beauty, her grace, her status as the queen of Sparta and wife of Menelaus. The enormity of what he had done began to dawn on him, but it was too late. The choice had been made, and the gods had taken their leave, leaving Paris alone under the vast sky. The hills were silent once more, the golden apple still warm in his hands. Paris stared at it, his heart heavy with the weight of Aphrodite's promise. He had been a simple shepherd, content in his isolation, but now he was bound to a destiny that would upend his life and the world. In the distance, the first stars began to emerge, their cold light indifferent to the turmoil unfolding below. Paris felt their gaze, distant and unmoved, as though they, too, knew what was to come. The gods had set the wheels of fate in motion, and there would be no turning back. The evening air in Sparta was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly turned earth. The palace courtyard glowed softly under the silver light of the moon, its ancient stones whispering tales of gods and mortals to those who cared to listen. Helen walked through the garden in quiet solitude, her silken robes trailing behind her like ripples in a still pond. The weight of her crown, though absent on her head, seemed ever present in her mind. Tonight, as always, she sought solace in the quiet. From the shadows of an olive tree, Paris watched her. He had arrived in Sparta as a guest, a Trojan prince seeking diplomacy and friendship. Yet diplomacy had not brought him here, nor had friendship driven him to cross the Aegean. His heart had been stolen long before he set foot on Spartan soil, stolen by the promise of the goddess Aphrodite herself. The most beautiful woman in the world, she had said, and now she stood before him, her very presence more intoxicating than the finest wine. Helen turned her face toward the moon, her features soft and luminous, her beauty ethereal and undeniable. Paris felt a pang in his chest, a mix of reverence and longing that was almost painful. He had imagined this moment countless times, but no vision could compare to the reality of her. She was not just beautiful, she was devastating. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. The rustle of his cloak caught her attention, and she turned, her eyes meeting his with a calm curiosity. "Prince Paris," she said, her voice smooth and measured, carrying the subtle grace of one accustomed to command. "My Lady Helen," he replied, bowing slightly. His voice was warm, threaded with an earnestness that set him apart from the other men she had encountered. "I did not mean to disturb your peace." Helen steadied him, her gaze searching. Paris was striking, with dark hair that fell just past his shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of distant horizons. He was unlike the Spartans, softer in his manner, his smile tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "You are far from disturbing," she said after a pause, gesturing for him to join her. "The garden is large enough for two." He stepped beside her, his heart pounding with every movement. For a moment, they walked in silence, the night alive with the sound of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Paris spoke first, his voice low. "Do you ever feel caged by all this?" Helen glanced at him, surprised by the boldness of his question. "Caged," she repeated. He nodded. "The walls, the expectations, the endless eyes watching your every move. Does it not feel suffocating?" Helen looked away, her expression unreadable. The answer was too complex, too weighted with truths she had spent years hiding. "It is, my life," she said finally, the words carefully chosen. "But is it the life you want?" Paris pressed gently. "Or the one you were given?" Helen stopped walking, her hands clasping the edge of a marble bench as she turned to face him. "What does it matter what I want?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "A queen has no place for such indulgence." Paris stepped closer, his voice soft but insistent. "And what of Helen, not the queen? What does she desire?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Helen felt her composure falter, the mask she had worn for so long slipping ever so slightly. "Why do you ask such things?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What could you possibly offer me that I do not already have?" Paris hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. "Freedom," he said simply. "The freedom to be seen, not as a queen or a trophy, but as a woman. To be loved, not for what you represent, but for who you are." The honesty in his voice was disarming, and Helen found herself searching his face for any trace of deceit. She saw none. In that moment, she felt something stir within her, a yearning she had buried long ago, a flicker of rebellion against the life she had been forced to lead. But even as the feeling grew, her mind pulled back, warning her of the dangers it carried. "And what if I told you that freedom is an illusion?" she asked, her tone bittersweet. "That even love, as noble as it seems, is but another chain?" Then I would tell you that I would gladly bear those chains for the chance to love you, Paris replied, his voice firm. And that the gods themselves would envy what we could create together. Helen's breath caught, the intensity of his words both thrilling and terrifying. She had heard many declarations in her life, but none had felt like this, so raw, so genuine, so dangerous. She turned away, her thoughts racing, her heart pounding against the confines of her chest. Paris, she said finally, her voice trembling. You do not know what you are saying. The cost of such a thing, it would destroy us both. Then let it destroy me, he said, stepping closer. For I have already lost myself to you. The world seemed to hold its breath as he reached for her hand, his touch warm and tentative. Helen didn't pull away, though every rational part of her screamed to do so. She looked up at him, her resolve wavering under the weight of his gaze. The night felt alive, the stars above watching with a quiet intensity, the air thick with the promise of what was to come. Helen knew she stood on the precipice of a choice that could change everything, her life, his, and the fate of nations. Yet in that moment, all she could feel was the pull of the man before her, and the ache of a heart that longed to be free. The night was a shadowed tapestry, the heavens a scattering of stars that seemed to pulse with quiet anticipation. Sparta lay hushed, its formidable walls standing like sentinels against the dark. Inside the palace, all was still, except for two figures moving through the gloom, their hearts pounding as though in defiance of the silence around them. Helen's cloak swirled around her as she slipped through the corridors, her steps light but urgent. The palace that had once felt like a cage now seemed a labyrinth, its every shadow a potential betrayer. Yet she moved with determination, her mind set on what lay ahead. Freedom. Love. Paris. He was waiting for her near the garden gate, his figure barely discernible in the moonlight. The sight of him, tall and steadfast, sent a surge of warmth through her chest. She quickened her pace, her heart beating in time with the hurried rhythm of her steps. Helen, Paris whispered as she approached, his voice carrying both relief and urgency. She nodded, her gaze locking with his. I'm ready. Paris reached out, his hand brushing hers in a fleeting touch that spoke volumes. He had spent every waking moment since meeting her consumed by this plan, knowing it was as dangerous as it was inevitable. He could see the resolve in her eyes, but also the faint glimmer of fear. Are you sure? He asked, his voice low. Helen hesitated only a moment. I have lived my whole life in chains, she said, her voice trembling yet firm. If I stay, I lose myself. If I leave, at least I choose who I am. Her words filled him with both admiration and a fierce sense of protectiveness. He took her hand in his, pulling her close. Then we leave tonight. Together. The docks were a maze of shadows and whispers, the sea lapping gently against the hulls of waiting ships. Paris had arranged for a vessel to take them to Troy, a swift and sturdy ship manned by sailors loyal to his house. As they approached, Helen felt the weight of her choice pressing down on her chest. Each step away from Sparta was a step away from her husband, her daughter, her life as queen. She paused for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Paris turned to her, his expression softening as he saw the conflict in her eyes. We can go back, he said, though the words felt like ash on his tongue. Say the word, and I'll take you home. Helen shook her head, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. There is no home for me there anymore. Paris held her gaze, the air between them charged with an intensity that seemed to hold the world at bay. Without another word, he led her onto the ship, the wooden planks creaking beneath their feet as they boarded. The sailors worked quickly, their movements efficient and quiet. The ship's sails unfurled like ghostly wings, catching the wind and propelling them into the open sea. Helen stood at the stern, her hands gripping the railing as she watched Sparta fade into the distance, its lights dwindling until they were swallowed by the horizon. The sea was vast and restless, its waves shimmering like liquid silver under the moonlight. Helen felt the salty breeze on her face, a strange mix of exhilaration and dread coursing through her veins. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, stepping into an uncertain future with a man she barely knew but felt irrevocably drawn to. Paris joined her at the railing, his presence a steadying force. "You're thinking of them," he said softly. Helen nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "My daughter," she whispered. "Hermione. What will she think of me?" "She'll understand one day," Paris said, though he knew the words were a fragile comfort. "You did this for yourself, for your happiness. That's something worth fighting for." Helen turned to him, her eyes glistening. "And what if I've doomed us both? What if this is a mistake?" Paris cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes, we'll face it as one." His words wrapped around her like a shield, and for the first time that night, Helen allowed herself to lean into his strength. She rested her forehead against his, their breaths mingling as the sea carried them farther from the life they had left behind. Hours passed as the ship cut through the water, the coastline of Sparta now a distant memory. The stars above seemed brighter, their light spilling onto the waves as though blessing their passage. Helen and Paris sat together under the open sky, their silence filled with unspoken promises and shared resolve. Yet beneath the calm, Helen knew the storm was coming. Her choice, their flight, would not go unanswered. The gods were watching, their amusement laced with malice, and Menelaus would not let her go without a fight. But for now, under the expanse of the heavens and the gentle rhythm of the sea, Helen allowed herself a moment of peace. She leaned against Paris, the warmth of his presence anchoring her in the chaos of her thoughts. Whatever fate awaited them, they had chosen it. And for the first time in her life, Helen felt free. The shores of Troy rose from the mist like a vision, golden sands meeting the deep blue of the sea. The city perched atop a hill, its walls towering and formidable, shining in the light of the sun. As the ship drew closer, Helen stood at the bow, her hands gripping the rail as a mix of awe and trepidation coursed through her. Paris stood beside her, his presence steady and unyielding. His expression held a quiet pride, but his eyes darted frequently between Helen and the approaching harbor, as though searching for any sign of danger or disapproval. He had dreamt of this moment, the triumphant return to his homeland, the prize of the gods at his side, but now that it was here, he could feel the weight of what lay ahead. As the ship eased into the harbor, the city began to stir. Fishermen paused in their work, their nets forgotten as they watched the vessel glide through the water. Children ran along the shore, their laughter replaced by whispers as they saw the passengers on board. The news would spread quickly. Prince Paris had returned, and he had brought with him a woman of unimaginable beauty. The gangplank was lowered, and Paris descended first, his steps confident but measured. He turned and extended a hand to Helen. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the curious and watchful faces of the Trojans gathering at the docks. Then, with a deep breath, she took his hand and stepped onto the foreign soil. The air felt different here, charged with both anticipation and unease. Helen lifted her chin, her regal bearing betraying none of the storm within her. She was no stranger to scrutiny, but this was unlike anything she had experienced before. Every eye was on her, every whisper a thread in a tapestry of judgment and speculation. "Welcome to Troy," Paris said softly, his voice laced with both pride and apprehension. Helen nodded, her lips curving into a faint, polite smile as she surveyed her surroundings. The city was beautiful, its architecture bold and elegant, its streets alive with the hum of commerce and life. Yet beneath its splendor lay a tension she couldn't ignore, a silent acknowledgement of the turmoil her presence would bring. By the time they reached the gates, a small crowd had gathered. Among them stood Hector, Paris's elder brother, his expression unreadable as he watched the pair approach. Hector was everything Paris was not, stern, measured, and deeply rooted in his sense of duty. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Paris with the weight of unspoken questions. "Brother," Paris began, his tone warm but cautious. "I have returned." "And brought with you a storm," Hector replied, his voice calm but edged with reproach. His eyes flicked to Helen, lingering for a moment before returning to Paris. "This is the woman you spoke of?" "She is Helen," Paris said, his tone firm as he placed a hand gently on her arm. "The gods themselves decreed it." Hector's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned to Helen and inclined his head in a gesture of respect. "Lady Helen," he said, his voice polite but distant. "Welcome to Troy." Helen inclined her head in return, her poise unshaken despite the tension crackling between the brothers. "Thank you, Prince Hector," she said, her voice smooth. "Your city is as magnificent as its reputation." Hector's expression softened slightly at her words, but his unease was evident. He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. As they passed through the gates, the streets of Troy opened before them, lined with citizens who had gathered to catch a glimpse of the foreign queen. Helen walked beside Paris, her movements graceful and deliberate, her gaze steady. The whispers followed her like a shadow, voices murmuring of her beauty, her origins, and the chaos that might follow in her wake. When they reached the palace, Priam, the king of Troy, awaited them in the grand hall. The years had etched lines of wisdom and weariness into his face, but his eyes held a warmth that surprised Helen. He rose from his throne as they entered, his gaze assessing but not unkind. "Father," Paris said, bowing deeply, "I have returned, and I bring with me Helen of Sparta." Priam's gaze shifted to Helen, his expression inscrutable. For a moment, the hall was silent, the air thick with expectation. Then, to Helen's surprise, the king stepped forward and took her hands in his. "You are most welcome here," Priam said, his voice gentle but strong. "Whatever past you leave behind, know that you are now under the protection of Troy." Helen blinked, the kindness in his tone catching her off guard. She had expected judgment, perhaps even anger, but there was none of that in Priam's demeanor. For the first time since stepping foot on Trojan soil, she felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you, King Priam," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions within her. "Your words mean more to me than you can know." As the court settled into the formalities of welcome, Helen stood beside Paris, her mind racing. She had entered Troy as an outsider, a foreign queen whose very name carried the weight of scandal. Yet here, under the gaze of its people and the protection of its king, she began to feel the stirrings of something she had long thought lost. The gods had brought her here, and though she did not know what lay ahead, she could not deny the sense of destiny that clung to the air. The arrival was just the beginning. The sun bathed Troy in a golden glow, casting long shadows across its towering walls and bustling streets. From her perch on the palace balcony, Helen gazed out at the city that had become her new home. It was beautiful, yes, but also strange, its rhythm foreign, its voices unfamiliar. She stood there, a figure of grace and elegance, draped in silks gifted by Priam himself, her hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. To the Trojans below, she was a vision, an ethereal queen whose beauty defied mortal comprehension. Yet within her heart, Helen carried the weight of 1,000 doubts. Her presence in Troy was a paradox. She had been welcomed with open arms by the royal family, yet whispers of dissent trailed her every step. She had been granted a place of honor, yet she could feel the eyes of the people, watchful and wary. The palace halls echoed with life, but Helen often felt like a ghost, moving through a world that both revered and resented her. Servants averted their gazes as they passed, their hushed murmurs filling the air in her wake. Courtiers bowed respectfully, but their smiles never reached their eyes. Even within the walls meant to protect her, Helen felt exposed, as though the gods themselves had left her under the eternal scrutiny of the world. Paris, ever attentive and adoring, tried to shield her from the growing tensions. He lavished her with gifts, jewels that sparkled like the stars, perfumes from the farthest reaches of the known world, and garments fit for a goddess. He spoke to her with a tenderness that melted her resolve, painting vivid pictures of a future filled with love and joy. Yet even his love could not silence the unease growing within Helen. She could see the strain on his face, the shadow of worry in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The truth was inescapable. Her presence in Troy was not merely a scandal, it was a spark hovering dangerously close to a powder keg. The Trojan people had accepted her because their king had commanded it, but loyalty was a fragile thing. For every citizen enchanted by her beauty, there were two who questioned her loyalty, her motives, her worth. To them, she was a foreign queen who had brought with her the wrath of Sparta and the threat of war. Helen did not blame them for their fear. She felt it herself, an ever-present shadow that loomed over her every thought. She had heard the messengers who came to the palace, their voices grim as they recounted news of Menelaus's fury. She had seen the council meetings where Hector and Paris spoke in hushed tones, their faces dark with concern. Hector, in particular, remained a figure of quiet judgment in her life. While he treated her with respect, she could feel the weight of his disapproval. He was a man of honor, one who valued duty above all else, and he made no effort to hide his belief that Paris's actions had endangered Troy. One evening, Helen found herself alone in the palace gardens, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, their light casting a silvery glow over the marble statues and winding paths. She sat on a stone bench, her hands resting in her lap, her thoughts heavy. "Do you regret coming here?" The voice was deep, steady, and unmistakable. Helen turned to find Hector standing a few paces away, his broad frame silhouetted against the garden's soft light. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "I do not regret choosing my freedom," she said after a pause, her voice calm but tinged with melancholy. "But I fear what that choice may cost." Hector regarded her for a long moment, his gaze searching. "Freedom is not without its price," he said finally. "And in your case, that price may be steep." Helen looked away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her gown. "Do you think I am a curse upon your city?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hector's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "I think you are a woman caught in the web of the gods' games. And I think my brother's heart blinded him to the risks he has taken." His words stung, but Helen found no malice in them, only a brutal honesty that she could not fault. "And what of you?" she asked. "Do you blame me for what may come?" Hector's sigh was heavy, his gaze turning to the distant horizon. "Blame is a luxury we cannot afford," he said. "What matters now is what we do with the choices that have been made." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. Then Hector turned and walked away, leaving Helen alone once more. As the days turned to weeks, Helen tried to find her place within the Trojan court. She attended feasts and ceremonies, her presence a dazzling distraction that masked the unease beneath the surface. She learned the names of the courtiers, the rituals of the people, the stories of the gods they revered. Yet no matter how much she tried to belong, she could not shake the feeling that she was an outsider, a queen in name but not in heart. Paris's love was a balm to her wounds, but even it could not erase the growing tensions between them. He refused to acknowledge the danger, insisting that their love was worth any price. Helen wanted to believe him, but each day brought new reminders of the storm gathering on the horizon. One morning, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the city, a procession of soldiers passed through the gates, their shields glinting in the sunlight. The sight filled her with a sense of foreboding she could not ignore. War was coming, she realized, and it would come because of her. The gods had given her beauty, but they had also cursed her with the power to unravel kingdoms. Now, as the Queen of Troy, Helen understood the terrible truth of her position. She was no longer just a woman or even a queen, she was a symbol, a force, a spark that could ignite the world. And the flames were drawing closer. The winds shifted, carrying with them an unmistakable scent of conflict. It had begun as whispers in the streets of Troy, a murmur in the halls of the palace, but soon those whispers grew into something much louder, much more dangerous. A storm was brewing on the horizon, and Helen, for all her beauty, could not escape its fury. It started with the ships. They appeared on the distant horizon one fateful morning, a fleet of Greek warships, their sails dark against the sky. The sight was enough to send a ripple of unease through the heart of the city. At first, the people thought it was a passing threat, perhaps some rogue pirates or minor skirmishers. But as the days passed and the fleet drew closer, the tension in Troy thickened. Paris had warned them, but even his words could not dispel the sense of dread that hung in the air. Inside the palace, word of the Greek fleet's arrival was met with silence. Priam, the wise and battle-worn king, sat in his chambers, his mind a maze of calculations. He had been anticipating this moment, perhaps not in the form it had come, but he had always known the day would come when the gods' games would destroy all that he had worked for. "Father," Paris's voice broke through the silence, his expression as solemn as it had ever been. "The ships are here. They have come for Helen." Priam's gaze was distant, as if he could already see the battlefield that was coming. "What are the Greeks demanding?" "War," Paris replied softly, his voice heavy with the weight of inevitability. "The wrath of Menelaus cannot be quelled by anything but blood." The truth hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. The Greeks had not come to parley, not to seek resolution. They had come to reclaim what was theirs, Helen. And in their minds, they would not stop until the city of Troy lay in ruin, its people scattered, its treasures plundered. Paris turned to Helen, who had been standing quietly in the shadows, her face pale but composed. She met his eyes, and in that fleeting moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They had been living on borrowed time. The war was no longer a distant possibility. It was here. Helen felt the weight of it all, the years of peace that had been shattered, the lives that would be lost, and the city that would be torn apart because of her. It was a bitter truth, one that lodged itself deep within her chest and made it difficult to breathe. She had thought she was escaping her past, but now it seemed her past had come for her, in the form of a burning fleet on the horizon and a king whose heart was full of vengeance. In the great hall of Troy, the council was called to discuss the threat. Hector, ever the strategist, was the first to speak. "We must prepare," he said, his voice calm but carrying the force of years of experience. "The Greeks will not wait. We must mobilize our forces, strengthen our defenses. Our walls will hold." His words were met with murmurs of agreement, but Helen could see the unease beneath the bravado. The Trojans had built their city to be impregnable, but even the strongest walls could be breached with enough force, enough determination. Priam's face remained unreadable as he looked to his son, Paris. "Paris, what will you do?" Paris hesitated, his heart heavy. "I will fight for Troy, as I must." His voice was filled with conviction, but Helen could hear the faint tremor beneath it. This was no longer a matter of love or pride. It was a matter of survival. The gods had declared their judgment, and it was blood they demanded. Helen felt as though she were being dragged to the very heart of it, a sacrifice made in the name of love and wrath, a pawn on a board she had not asked to play on. As the council continued, the sound of hooves echoed through the palace courtyard. The scouts had returned, their faces grim. "The Greeks are close," one of them reported. "They are already sending envoys with their demands." "Demands?" Hector repeated, his eyes narrowing. "We will give them nothing." Paris clenched his fists, his mind racing. This was the moment he had feared, the moment he had tried to avoid. The consequences of his actions, his desire to win Helen's love and defy the wrath of Menelaus, were now too real to deny. He had sparked the fire that would consume his city, his people, and his family. And for all his love, he could not put it out. Helen stood, her voice breaking the silence that had settled over the council. "What will happen now?" Priam turned his gaze upon her, his eyes full of both sorrow and resignation. "War, my queen. War is what happens now." The words echoed in the chambers, a sentence passed that could not be undone. The council erupted into heated debate, voices raised, arguments flying as each general and noble spoke of how best to face the threat before them. But to Helen, the sounds blurred, her mind a fog of conflicting emotions. She had long known that this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. In the days that followed, Troy readied itself for battle. The streets were filled with the sound of marching soldiers, their armor clanking as they prepared for the impending siege. The women of Troy gathered, their faces etched with fear, and their hands busied themselves with making armor, packing supplies, and praying to the gods. Helen walked the halls of the palace, her heart heavy with grief. She had seen the men go, kissed them farewell, and prayed that they would return, though deep down, she knew some would never return. She was, after all, the cause of it all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Paris took her hand and led her to the top of the palace tower. From here, the entire city could be seen, the great walls, the bustling streets, and beyond them, the sea and the Greek ships waiting like predators in the distance. "We have no choice now," Paris said softly, his voice thick with the weight of what lay ahead. Helen looked out over the city, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I never wanted war." "I know," Paris said, squeezing her hand. "But we are beyond turning back now. We must stand." The first arrow struck the walls of Troy at dawn. The war had begun. The scent of burning wood hung thick in the air, mixing with the salt of the sea and the dust of a city under siege. The once thriving streets of Troy had turned to a battleground, and Helen, standing in the shadow of the palace, felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The once bright and vibrant city was now a place of mourning and fear, and it was all because of her. Her beauty, the very thing that had once earned her the title of the most coveted woman in the world, had now become a curse. Every crack of thunder on the battlefield, every scream that echoed through the streets, was a reminder that her actions had sparked the flames of war. Helen watched from the tower as the Greek army continued its relentless advance, their ships lining the coast like a dark and looming tide. She had once believed that her love for Paris could shield her from the consequences of her choices. But now, standing amidst the ruins of the city she had once admired from afar, Helen realized the bitter truth: love could not protect her from the destruction her beauty had wrought. The war had taken so much already, lives, hopes, dreams, but the true cost was something far more intangible. Troy had become a shadow of its former self, a city on the brink of collapse, and it was all because of her. Helen, the woman who had been adored and revered, now felt the sharp sting of guilt that cut deeper than any spear ever could. She stood in the quiet of her chambers, gazing at her reflection in the mirror, but the face that stared back at her was no longer the confident, radiant woman who had once captured the hearts of kings. There was a hollow emptiness in her eyes, an unspoken sorrow that weighed heavily on her soul. The faces of the men who had died in this war danced behind her closed eyelids, brave men who had fought and bled for a cause they believed in. For what? For a woman? For a love that had turned out to be nothing more than a fleeting desire, a temptation that had set the world ablaze? Helen had seen the faces of the warriors, their bodies carried back into the city after the fighting, their families weeping in the streets. Every death was a blow to her, a reminder that she had played her part in this tragedy. Every life lost felt like an arrow aimed straight through her heart. It was not just Paris's love that had driven her to Troy. It was also the need for escape from a life of constraints, from a future that had been arranged for her since the moment she was born. As the war dragged on, the women's lives grew harder. Food became scarce, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the palace halls. Each day, they waited for news of their husbands, their brothers, their fathers. Some of the women tried to stay strong, putting on a brave face in front of the others. But behind the closed doors of their chambers, their tears flowed freely, their sorrow spilling over like a river that could not be dammed. Andromache, in particular, felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her heart had already been torn apart once when she had lost Hector on the battlefield, but her grief only deepened when she looked at their son. She saw the boy's innocence, the way his eyes sparkled with wonder and hope, and it broke her heart. She would raise him alone, without his father, in a world that was growing darker by the day. The fear of what would become of him, of what fate awaited the children of Troy, was more than she could bear. Will he ever know his father? Andromache whispered to herself, the question hanging in the air like a prayer. She had no answer. No one did. As the siege of Troy continued, the women found themselves pulled into roles they had never imagined for themselves. They became warriors in their own right, not with swords or shields, but with their will and their strength. They tended to the wounded, nursed the dying, and gave what little comfort they could to those who returned from the battlefield. They wove the fabric of the city together with their hands, never faltering, even as the world around them crumbled. Cassandra, too, had her part to play, though it was one of torment. She could not save her city, but she could still care for those who remained. Her heart ached as she saw the women of Troy suffering under the weight of their fate. She, too, was a prisoner, bound by her curse, by the knowledge she could not share, by the future she could not change. But she still walked among the others, offering what solace she could, her voice soft with the knowledge that she had no power to stop the storm that was about to break. Helen, on the other hand, stood apart from them all. She could not escape the guilt that clung to her like a second skin, could not erase the scars of her choices. She was the catalyst, the one who had set this tragedy in motion. But as she moved through the streets of Troy, among the women who had seen their lives torn apart by the war, she realized that she, too, was one of them. She was a woman who had lost everything, her home, her family, her peace, and who had been left to watch as the world she had once known fell into chaos. The women of Troy were not just victims of war. They were survivors. And as the city's walls began to crack under the pressure of the Greek siege, it was these women who would hold Troy together, even as it threatened to fall apart. They were the silent warriors, the unsung heroes of the city, whose strength would outlast the battle and whose sorrow would echo through the ages. The air was heavy in the halls of Troy, carrying the distant sounds of battle like an ominous heartbeat. Within the walls of the palace, Paris stood near a marble column, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the city walls. His hands rested on the hilt of his sword, a weapon that looked untouched, its blade unmarked by the blood of war. To those who passed him, he seemed calm, his face a mask of confidence. But inside, Paris carried a turmoil he could not escape, a truth that gnawed at him, whispering his own inadequacies into the quiet moments of his mind. Paris, the Prince of Troy, the man who had been deemed worthy by Aphrodite herself, had become the symbol of love and beauty. He had won Helen, the woman whose face was said to rival the goddesses, but the cost of that love was becoming unbearable. While Hector, his elder brother, was celebrated as the warrior of Troy, Paris stood as a stark contrast, a lover, not a fighter. And in the face of a war sparked by his actions, that contrast had turned from a source of pride to one of shame. The people of Troy whispered behind closed doors, their voices tinged with resentment. They saw Hector riding into battle, his armor dented and bloodied, returning with the scars of a man who bore the weight of his city on his shoulders. And then they saw Paris, polished and pristine, more concerned with the placement of a necklace on Helen's throat than the placement of soldiers on the battlefield. "Is this the man we fight for?" they muttered when they thought no one could hear. "Is this the hero Troy deserves?" Paris had heard the whispers. They stung worse than any physical wound. He had never been Hector, nor had he ever wanted to be. He wasn't born for the brutality of war, for the relentless push and pull of strategy and sacrifice. His world had always been one of soft words and sweeter pursuits, of music and charm, of beauty and desire. And yet, here he was, standing in a city that burned for him. He closed his eyes and thought of Helen. Her face was a constant in his mind, a source of both comfort and agony. He had risked everything for her beauty, her laughter, her mere presence. When he had stood before the goddesses on Mount Ida, clutching the golden apple, it had been Aphrodite's promise of Helen that had swayed him. He could still hear her words, smooth as honey, "Choose me, and I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world." And he had chosen. Of course, he had chosen. How could he not? But now, as he stood on the precipice of a war that had claimed so many lives, Paris could not help but wonder if that choice had been worth the cost. His love for Helen burned as brightly as ever, but the flames of that love had ignited a fire that threatened to consume everything. Hector's words rang in his ears, sharp and unrelenting. "You are my brother, Paris, but you are also a coward. This war is your doing, and yet you leave the fighting to others. How can you stand by and watch as men die for your mistakes?" Paris had no answer. He had tried to stand beside Hector on the battlefield once, determined to prove that he was more than the sum of his beauty and charm. But the clash of swords, the screams of men, the sight of blood pooling on the ground, it had overwhelmed him. He had faltered, his courage slipping away like sand through his fingers. He was no warrior. He never had been. In his heart, Paris knew that he was not blind to his own weaknesses. He knew that he lacked the strength and resilience that Hector possessed, that he lacked the wisdom of Priam or the resolve of Cassandra. But he also knew that he loved Helen, and that love was the only thing he could cling to in the chaos of this war. It was his solace, his reason for enduring the disdain of his people and the weight of his own guilt. But even his love for Helen could not shield him from the harsh truths of war. Every time he saw Hector return from the battlefield, bruised and battered, Paris felt the sharp pang of inadequacy. Every time he watched the people of Troy bury their dead, he felt the crushing weight of their unspoken blame. He knew they saw him as weak, and perhaps they were right. Perhaps he was weak. But Paris could not change who he was. He could not suddenly become the warrior they wanted him to be. One night, as the city slept and the fires of the Greek camp flickered in the distance, Paris found himself in the temple of Apollo, standing before the statue of the god. The marble figure loomed above him, its expression cold and unyielding, as though it could see straight through to the heart of Paris's doubts. "Why did you choose me?" Paris whispered, his voice breaking in the silence. "Why did the gods choose me to bear this burden?" The temple gave no answer, only the echo of his words bouncing off the stone walls. Paris sank to his knees, his hands clenched into fists. He had spent his life reveling in his charm, his beauty, his ability to win hearts with a single glance. But none of that mattered now. None of it could save Troy. In his darkest moments, Paris thought of running. He imagined taking Helen and leaving Troy behind, escaping to a place where the weight of the war could not reach them. But he knew such thoughts were the fantasies of a coward. He could not abandon his family, his city, his people, not now, not when they needed him most. No matter how much he longed to escape the crushing burden of his choices, Paris knew he could not run from the consequences of his actions. He stood, his knees trembling, and turned back toward the palace. The city was still, its streets cloaked in shadows. Paris walked through the quiet, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he would never be the hero Troy wanted him to be. But even in his weakness, even in his doubt, there was a flicker of resolve, a fragile ember that refused to be extinguished. He would fight, not with the strength of his sword, but with the only thing he had ever known, his love for Helen. It wasn't enough to save the city, he knew that. But it was all he had. And for Paris, it would have to be enough. The walls of Troy, once a symbol of unyielding strength, stood scarred and battered under the relentless assault of the Greeks. For 9 long years, they had held firm, defying the onslaught of warriors driven by vengeance and pride. But as the 10th year dawned, the city's resilience began to show cracks, both in its stone fortifications and in the hearts of its people. The siege was not just a test of Troy's walls, it was a test of its soul. The Greek forces, led by King Agamemnon, had surrounded the city like a noose tightening around its throat. Ships lined the shores as far as the eye could see, their sails now torn and weathered from years of conflict. Fires burned in the Greek camp, their smoke curling into the sky, a constant reminder of the enemy that waited just beyond reach. Inside Troy, the tension was palpable. The once thriving city had become a shadow of itself, its vibrant streets now filled with the weary faces of a population worn thin by years of war. Supplies were running low. The granaries that had once overflowed with wheat were now nearly empty, and the people whispered of hunger as their daily rations dwindled. The rivers that flowed through the land seemed to carry not life, but the despair of a city on the brink of collapse. The warriors of Troy, led by the valiant Hector, fought with a desperation born of love for their homeland. Each skirmish beyond the walls felt like a gamble, each victory a fleeting moment of hope. But the losses weighed heavily. Hector, their golden prince, returned from the battlefield with more than scars. He carried the burden of every life lost, every friend who fell beside him. The Greeks, too, were worn by the years of battle. Their great heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, were not untouched by the grinding years of war. Achilles, with his unmatched skill and unrelenting wrath, was both the terror of Troy and a divisive force among his own. His quarrel with Agamemnon over the captured maiden Briseis had shaken the unity of the Greek forces, casting a shadow over their already precarious alliance. Yet despite their struggles, the Greeks continued their siege with unyielding determination. To them, the war was more than a quest to reclaim Helen. It had become a test of honor, a battle to avenge the insult dealt to Menelaus when his wife was taken from him. And so, the siege dragged on, the Greeks' relentless attacks meeting the fierce resistance of Troy in a cycle of bloodshed and destruction. By day, the fields beyond the walls became a battlefield, the clash of swords and the roar of warriors echoing across the plains. By night, the cries of the wounded and the mourning of the bereaved filled the air, a haunting symphony of loss. The stars above seemed indifferent to the suffering below, their cold light shining down on the carnage without pause. Among the Greek forces, Odysseus watched the siege with calculating eyes. The clever king of Ithaca, known for his cunning, saw the futility of the endless battles. He spoke often of strategy, of finding a way to break Troy's defenses without further bleeding their forces dry. It was Odysseus who began to weave the threads of an idea that would one day become the Greeks' greatest triumph and Troy's ultimate downfall. Inside the city, the people clung to hope, though it grew thinner with each passing day. They prayed to the gods, offering sacrifices in the hopes of divine intervention. In the temple of Apollo, Cassandra knelt in fervent prayer, her voice a plea to the heavens. Yet the gods remained silent, their silence a cruel reminder that the fate of Troy lay not in their hands, but in the choices of mortals. Helen moved through the palace, her presence a constant reminder of the war's origin. To the people of Troy, she was a paradox, both the cause of their suffering and a queen who had embraced their city as her own. She carried herself with grace, though her heart was heavy with guilt. She could not walk the streets without feeling the weight of their stares, the unspoken blame that lingered in the air. Paris, too, felt the strain of the siege. The love that had burned so brightly between him and Helen now bore the weight of the war it had ignited. Paris had tried to prove himself, to stand as a prince of Troy and not just the man who had taken Helen. But each time he stepped onto the battlefield, the shadow of his elder brother Hector loomed over him, a constant reminder of what he was not. As the months dragged on, the siege became a war of attrition. The Greeks built towering siege engines, great wooden constructs designed to breach the walls of Troy. The Trojans responded with ingenuity of their own, hurling flaming projectiles and boiling oil to repel the invaders. It was a brutal dance, each side testing the other's limits, each trying to find the breaking point. Within the palace, King Priam stood as a pillar of strength for his people. The aging king bore the weight of Troy's fate on his shoulders, his once proud frame now stooped under the burden of his city's suffering. He sought counsel from his advisors, from Hector, and even from Helen, whose insights into the Greek forces often proved invaluable. Yet no amount of wisdom could turn back the tide of war. The Greeks' greatest advantage was their fleet, which allowed them to control the flow of supplies and reinforcements. The Trojans, surrounded on all sides, had no such luxury. Each day brought new challenges, new losses. The people of Troy grew thinner, their faces gaunt with hunger. The once vibrant markets were now silent, the stalls empty of goods. And still, the city endured, its spirit unbroken despite the odds. As the siege wore on, a sense of inevitability began to settle over both sides. The Greeks, though weary, were determined to see the war through to its end. The Trojans, though battered, refused to surrender. It was a battle of wills as much as of swords, a clash of two nations unwilling to yield. In the end, it was not brute force that would decide the fate of Troy, but a single act of cunning, a plan that would forever alter the course of history. But for now, the siege continued, a grinding, unrelenting storm that neither side could escape. The walls of Troy stood firm, but cracks were beginning to show, not just in the stone, but in the hearts of those who called the city home. The nights in Troy were long and suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and the sound of distant cries, as if the city itself was mourning. Helen walked through the palace, her steps heavy, her heart burdened by a weight that no crown or title could ever alleviate. Every room she entered seemed to echo with the ghosts of lives lost, and every face she passed held eyes that burned with resentment and sorrow. To the people of Troy, she was not just a queen, but the reason their city bled. Helen had once been the embodiment of beauty, a woman whose radiance could make kings and gods fall to their knees. But now, as the war dragged on, she was something else entirely, a symbol of destruction, a reminder of a love that had torn a world apart. Every glance from the people of Troy pierced her like a dagger, and every whispered conversation behind her back felt like an accusation. They blamed her for the death of their sons, their husbands, their fathers. They cursed her name with a bitterness that would never leave their lips. She had not asked for this. She had not asked to be the cause of a war that would ravage a city, that would take lives, that would break the hearts of those who had once welcomed her as a queen. But in the stillness of the night, with only the soft rustle of her silk gown and the distant cry of a soldier, Helen could no longer escape the truth. She was the reason it all began. Her beauty had been the spark that ignited the flames of destruction. Her love for Paris had been the catalyst for the wrath of the Greeks. What had once seemed like a grand, passionate love story now felt like a cruel joke, a tragedy that had consumed everything in its path. And so, every day, Helen lived with guilt. It was a constant companion, always there, lurking in the back of her mind, whispering in the quiet moments between her breaths. She could see the faces of the dead in her dreams, hear the cries of mothers who had lost their sons, the screams of wives who would never hold their husbands again. She could feel the weight of their anger in every silent stare that followed her down the corridors. The city of Troy had once been her refuge. She had arrived as a bride, loved and cherished by her husband, Menelaus, before the gods' cruel game had torn them apart. But now, it felt like a prison. A gilded cage with no escape. Her love for Paris, once so bright and full of hope, had dulled with the years. How could it not? How could she look at the faces of those around her and not see the devastation that had come in the wake of her choices? How could she, in good conscience, look at her beloved Paris and still hold on to the love that had cost so many lives? Paris, for all his charm and warmth, could not absolve her of the sins she had committed. He was no longer the young prince she had fallen for, so eager to prove his worth. He, too, had been shaped by the war, his once strong spirit fraying under the pressure. She had heard his struggles, his quiet moments of doubt, his fear of failing his people. He, too, felt the weight of their choices, and yet he did not carry it like she did. He was a man torn between his love for her and his duty to Troy. But it was her who had led him here. It was her who had promised him everything and given him nothing but destruction. Andromache's face haunted her the most. The beautiful, devoted wife of Hector, the woman who had loved her husband with a purity that Helen had once envied. Andromache had been forced to watch as Hector, her warrior prince, had walked onto the battlefield to face the Greeks, faced the wrath of Achilles, and never returned. Her eyes were filled with a quiet grief that Helen could not bear. The same grief she now saw on every face she passed. The people of Troy had no use for a queen who had led them to war. They needed a savior, someone to end the bloodshed. But Helen knew deep down, there was no savior to be found, not for Troy, and not for her. The weight of their suffering hung around her neck like a heavy necklace, one she could not remove. Every prayer to the gods felt empty, every offering meaningless. She had once prayed for peace, for escape from the chaos she had unwittingly unleashed. But the gods were silent, as indifferent as they had always been. In her darkest moments, she wondered if they had always known what would happen. Did they play with her life like a game? Was this her fate, to burn in the fire of her own desires? She had seen the way Hector had looked at her in the moments before his death, the way his eyes had turned to ice as he thought of his wife and son. He had not blamed her, not openly. But there was something in his gaze, something that made her feel small, insignificant, like a speck of dust in the face of the grand tapestry of history. Was she merely a casualty of fate, a pawn in the hands of gods who cared nothing for the consequences of their whims? She closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she reached for the delicate silver necklace that hung from her neck, a gift from Paris, once a symbol of their love. Now it felt like a chain, one that bound her to a past she could not escape. She had dreamed of a life with Paris, a life free of bloodshed, free of the burden of guilt. But now, that dream felt as distant as the stars in the sky, as unreachable as the peace she longed for. Her heart broke every time she looked at the people of Troy, Every time she saw the soldiers return with bloodied faces, every time she saw children orphaned by the war she had helped ignite. How many more would die before this madness stopped? How many more innocent lives would be lost because of her? In the silence of her room, the guilt overwhelmed her. She longed to turn back time, to undo the choices that had led her here. But time could not be turned, and the war would not cease. The city of Troy was on the brink of collapse, and she was the reason it had come to this. The beautiful, cursed woman who had once been loved by gods and mortals alike. Now, she was nothing more than a shadow, a fading memory of a dream that had burned too brightly and left nothing but ash. Helen sank to her knees, tears falling freely down her cheeks. The guilt consumed her, and for the first time in years, she did not care to hide it. There would be no redemption for her. No forgiveness. Only the weight of the lives lost, the love she had once known, and the knowledge that she would carry this burden for the rest of her life. The gods had always played games with mortals, weaving their lives into the tapestry of divine machinations. The War of Troy was no different. From the very beginning, Helen had been a pawn in a celestial game far beyond her understanding. She had been chosen, not for her beauty or her love, but because her life was a tool, one that the gods would use to further their own endless, tangled desires. In the quiet moments when Helen gazed out over the city of Troy, watching the smoke rise from the Greek encampments, she could almost feel the invisible strings that pulled her, twisted her, and shaped her fate. It was as though she was an instrument in the hands of gods whose whims had no mercy, no regard for the lives they destroyed in their pursuit of power and pride. Zeus, the king of the gods, had watched over the chaos from his high throne on Olympus, silent and unmovable. He had set the stage for this war, with the fateful decision to offer Paris the golden apple, a simple act that had set into motion the events that would forever change the course of history. But now, as the war stretched on and the blood of both Trojans and Greeks soaked the earth, Zeus remained as cold and distant as ever, his gaze fixed on the shifting tides of fate. Helen could no longer feel the godly warmth that had once seemed to bless her. The gods who had once played in her favor, who had filled her with promises of love and power, now seemed nothing more than distant figures, watching her suffering from afar as if she were nothing more than a game piece to be moved around at will. For a while, Helen had believed the gods loved her, at least some of them. She had been the chosen prize of Paris, the woman whose beauty had been so legendary that even the goddesses could not resist their desire to possess her. Aphrodite had given her the promise of Paris's love, the one who would be her champion, the one who would whisk her away from Menelaus. It had been a dream come true. But that dream had turned into a nightmare. As the years passed in Troy, she began to feel the weight of her choices, the curse of beauty that had been her gift and her doom. She could no longer escape the knowledge that she had been nothing more than a tool in the gods' eyes. Paris had been their pawn, too, chosen by Aphrodite not for any worth of his own, but because the goddess of love had seen in him a chance to fulfill her own desires. It wasn't love that had guided Paris to her side, it was a divine command, a cruel manipulation of hearts and fates. Helen began to see that the gods had orchestrated everything. The quarrel between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite had been the spark. The golden apple had ignited it all, and she had been the prize, the object of their petty rivalry. She had been given no choice, no real agency, no freedom. She was merely a piece of the game, destined to fulfill the whims of gods whose powers reached far beyond her mortal understanding. Her prayers, once filled with hope, now seemed pointless. She prayed to Zeus, once the father of gods and men, the one who had been her protector, the one who had promised to watch over her. But in these times of darkness, where the city she had once loved now burned in the fires of war, Zeus's silence was deafening. The mighty god who had shaped the destinies of so many had abandoned her. She had hoped for guidance, for a sign, for something, anything, to show her that her suffering had some purpose, some meaning beyond the endless pain. But all she received was the cold, indifferent silence from Olympus. Helen's sense of abandonment was overwhelming. Once, she had believed she could appeal to the gods for aid, that they would intervene in her life as they had done for others. But now, as the screams of dying soldiers filled the air and the walls of Troy cracked under the weight of the siege, she could only feel the void of their absence. It was as though the gods had long ago moved on, indifferent to the human consequences of their divine machinations. Zeus, the very god who had fathered her, had chosen not to intervene, not to stop the war he had set in motion. Perhaps Zeus had grown bored of the game. Perhaps he had seen too much blood spilled and too many lives destroyed, and now the war was no longer of any interest to him. There was no justice in this war, no divine favor to be found. Helen had once believed that if she cried out to the gods, they would answer her. But now, she was nothing more than an echo in the dark, a mortal voice lost in the vast emptiness of the heavens. The silence of Zeus felt like a betrayal. Her father, who had been the king of gods, had once been the protector of the innocent, the ruler who set laws and dictated the fates of both gods and men. And yet, here she was, a woman cast aside by the very god who had allowed her life to spiral out of control. She had followed Paris, had left everything behind for him, and yet now, in the midst of a war that had claimed so many lives, she could not help but wonder if the gods had ever cared for her at all. The gods had played their parts. They had chosen sides, favored heroes, and manipulated the outcomes of battles. Aphrodite had ensured that Paris could never fail to win her love, while Hera and Athena had conspired against him, hoping to change the tide of the war. They had used Helen, not as a woman, but as a weapon in their own eternal struggle for power and influence. It was a game to them, a game where lives meant nothing and the lives of mortals were as disposable as the pawns on a chessboard. In her moments of deepest despair, Helen felt the weight of that realization. She had been nothing more than a toy in the hands of the gods, a beautiful plaything who had never had the freedom to choose her own destiny. The gods had given her life, had given her beauty, and had given her love, but they had also given her war, pain, and loss. The people of Troy suffered because of the gods' games, and Helen was no exception. She was a woman trapped in the middle of a war she had never intended to start, forced to live with the consequences of decisions that were not her own. And as the city crumbled, as the cries of the dying echoed in her ears, she realized that the gods, in their infinite power, had abandoned her. They had abandoned Troy. They had abandoned them all. Helen could only stand and watch, her heart heavy with guilt and regret, as the gods continued their eternal game, playing with the lives of mortals, with no thought to the devastation they left in their wake. The day Paris died was a day like any other, bleak, suffocating, filled with the acrid smell of smoke and blood. The siege of Troy had stretched on for so long that the earth itself seemed to mourn the endless cycle of violence. The walls of Troy, once a symbol of its might, now stood as mere witnesses to the suffering that had endured for nearly a decade. Inside those walls, the people had grown hollow, physically, mentally, and spiritually. And so had Paris. Helen had watched him change, over the years, from the vibrant, passionate prince she had once loved to a man who walked with shadows in his eyes. He had been so sure of his love for her when they had fled Sparta, so certain that his actions were justified, that their love was worth the bloodshed. But the war had worn him down, just as it had worn down all of Troy. He was no longer the man who had stood before her, full of youthful ambition and fiery desire. He was a soldier now, a prince trapped by his own choices. Helen saw it in the way he carried himself, his steps slower, his shoulders hunched, his hands often shaking as he clutched his bow. His once gleaming armor now bore the scars of years of battle. His youthful confidence had eroded under the weight of his people's expectations, the burden of a war that had not been his making but had become his undoing. Paris was no longer the conqueror of hearts, he was a shadow, a man haunted by his own actions. The death of Paris was not sudden, nor was it dramatic. It was not a fatal blow struck in the heat of battle, nor a heroic sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. It was the culmination of a slow, painful unraveling, a final chapter in a story that had been written in blood and tears. Paris had been weakened, both physically and emotionally, by the war. His body bore the evidence of his suffering, the wear and tear of countless skirmishes, the bruises and cuts that never seemed to heal, the weight of his own guilt and regret that clung to him like a shroud. On the day of his death, the Trojans found themselves once again facing the Greeks at the gates of their city. Paris had taken up his bow, though his hands were trembling, and his focus was uncertain. He had always been an excellent archer, but now, it seemed, his once deft hands no longer possessed the steady aim that had made him legendary. He had become a shell of the man he had been when he had first fallen in love with Helen, driven by love, by anger, by revenge. Now, those passions seemed distant, buried beneath layers of doubt and exhaustion. The Greeks, knowing Paris's reputation, had prepared for him. Achilles had long since returned to battle after his feud with Agamemnon had ended, and Hector's death had left an irreplaceable hole in Troy's defenses. The Greeks had planned their assault carefully, knowing that without Hector, the Trojans would be vulnerable, and Paris, despite his skill, was no longer the threat he once was. And so, when Paris stood in the heat of battle, drawing his bow, the arrow that had once flown true for love and war now seemed to falter. It was then that the fates themselves seemed to turn against him. As Paris stood atop the walls of Troy, his eyes locked onto the figure of the greatest warrior of the Greeks, the invincible Achilles. The legendary warrior was a towering figure of rage and power, a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of everyone who heard it. Paris, however, had no intention of facing him directly. He had no strength left for such a duel. Instead, he aimed his bow, hoping to strike a blow from a distance, to put an end to the torment that had stretched on for so long. But the gods, in their ever-watching gaze, had decided that Paris would not die at the hands of Achilles. No, they had other plans. In the moment that Paris released his arrow, Apollo, the god who had once favored him, intervened. The arrow flew, its trajectory altered by the divine hand of the god, and it struck not Achilles, but a different target. Paris's arrow found its mark not on the great warrior's heart, but on the heel, the one vulnerable spot of Achilles. The shot would prove fatal. But it was not Paris's victory. It was an accident, a twist of fate orchestrated by the gods, the cruelest twist of all. Paris's skill as an archer, his aim, his determination, all of it had been for nothing. He had not killed Achilles. The gods had decided that Troy would not fall so easily. The death of the great hero would be a long and painful one, but it was not Paris who would bring it about. And so, as Paris stood, his eyes wide with shock, he realized that his own fate had been sealed. His arrow had missed its intended target, and though it had struck Achilles' weak point, it was not he who would end the life of the Greek hero. The gods had played their game, and once again, Paris had been caught in their web. The final moments of Paris's life were a quiet, heartbreaking affair. He had been struck, though not fatally, by an arrow from the Greek archers who had seen him fall. It was not a noble death, not one befitting a prince. Paris had no chance to redeem himself, no chance to prove his worth in the eyes of the gods or his people. His death was nothing more than the consequence of years of mistakes, of a life that had been shaped by love, passion, and regret. Helen watched from the palace as her beloved Paris fell. She had seen him change over the years, had witnessed his transformation from the vibrant prince who had stolen her heart to the broken warrior who lay dying on the battlefield. And now, she would watch him die, his body carried back to the city he had once vowed to protect. There was no grand moment of reconciliation, no final, passionate declaration of love between them. There was only the quiet realization that it was too late for redemption, too late for love, too late for anything. Paris had given everything for a love that had only brought destruction. And now, he would die as he had lived, caught between gods and men, never truly free. Helen's heart shattered in that moment. She had wanted to believe that their love could survive anything, that they could overcome the forces that had torn the world apart. But love, in the end, had not been enough. The gods had made sure of that. As Paris's life slipped away, Helen felt the weight of his death crush her spirit. She had lost him, just as she had lost everything else, the love she had once cherished, the city that had once been her home, the future that had once been so bright. And in that moment, she understood, Paris had died not because of his own flaws, but because he had been caught in the game of the gods. And now, like him, she was nothing more than a pawn in their eternal game. The night was as dark as the heart of a storm, the air thick with tension. Troy had fallen into an uneasy silence, the kind that comes just before the end. After 10 long years of siege, the city's walls, once impregnable, stood weakened. The Trojans had fought valiantly, but now there was a sense of inevitable doom in the air, a quiet that could only mean one thing: the end was near. Helen had heard whispers of the Greeks' strange offering, the massive wooden horse left at the gates of Troy. A gift, they said, an offering to the gods to ensure safe passage home after the war. But Helen, ever sharp, had known better. She had seen too much of war, too much of the gods' cruel games, to believe that the Greeks would leave without one last trick. But even she could not have imagined the horror that would unfold. As night fell, the Trojans gathered around the enormous structure, admiring the gift that had been left behind. Some of them were cautious, others hopeful, but none of them knew what lay hidden inside. And among them, standing silently in the shadows, was Helen. Her heart, heavy with regret, watched with a mixture of dread and understanding. This was not just a horse. It was the final move in the gods' game, a tool to bring the war to its bloody, inevitable end. Helen had long understood the power of her beauty, how it had twisted the fates of so many, but tonight, the weight of her role felt different. It was as if the gods were using her once more, pushing her toward an action that would seal the fate of Troy and its people. She had been a pawn in this game from the very beginning, and now, as the war wound to its tragic close, she was being called upon again. The Trojans, eager for peace after years of suffering, began to debate what to do with the horse. Should they destroy it, or should they bring it into the city as a symbol of their victory, a gift from the gods? But Helen knew the answer, even if no one else did. Her heart pounded with the sickening realization that the Greeks had left this behind for a reason. They were not offering peace, they were offering destruction. In the hours that followed, the Trojans celebrated their victory, but the tension in Helen's chest grew unbearable. She couldn't shake the feeling that this night would bring nothing but ruin. The gods had not spared Troy, and no peace would come from this wooden beast. As the Trojans reveled, Helen slipped away from the celebrations, drawn to the horse with an unsettling urgency. What she saw there, what she felt there, was enough to chill her to her core. She approached the horse carefully, moving as silently as the shadows that danced across the ground. There were no voices, no sounds to alert anyone of her presence. And yet, she was not alone. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes caught the faintest movements inside the belly of the wooden horse. The Greeks. They were waiting, hidden, ready to strike at the heart of Troy when the time was right. Helen's mind raced as she understood the full scope of the plan. She knew the Greeks would attack when they were at their most vulnerable, under the cover of night. They would emerge from the horse, and with them, the final bloodshed that would tear Troy apart. But there was something else. Something she had not expected. It was not just her city that was at stake, it was her life, too. Her very existence had become a symbol, a key to this final moment of destruction. The Greeks had left her with no choice but to confront the ghosts of her past. She could no longer stand on the sidelines of this war. Her beauty, her betrayal, her love, and her shame, everything had led to this moment. And in the quiet of the night, she knew that she would play her part, whether she wished it or not. At that moment, a voice echoed softly in the shadows. It was a voice that she had not heard in years, one that chilled her to the bone, the voice of her former husband, Menelaus. "Do you see what they've done, Helen?" he asked, his tone both accusatory and filled with a strange sadness. "Do you see the end they've written for us? For our people?" Helen's heart ached as his words settled in. She had always believed that love would be her redemption, that in the arms of Paris, she had found something more than war. But now, standing in the dark before the wooden horse, she understood that nothing could erase the past, no matter how far she had run. But there was something else in Menelaus's voice, a strange calmness. A resigned acceptance of fate. In that moment, Helen realized that even he knew the war was over, that Troy's destruction had already been decided by powers far beyond their control. The gods had played their hand, and now, all they could do was watch as the final act unfolded. Suddenly, Helen felt a presence behind her. She turned, startled, to find herself face to face with a figure cloaked in shadow. It was Odysseus, the cunning Greek who had masterminded the entire ruse, the one who had crafted the plan that would bring Troy to its knees. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of victory and anticipation. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice low, like a whisper of wind that could carry the promise of destruction. "The horse. The final trick. The Greeks will enter Troy tonight, and tomorrow, it will all be over. The city will fall, and you," he paused, a twisted smile curling at the edges of his mouth, "will be free." Helen stood frozen, caught between the promise of freedom and the unbearable truth of her situation. Freedom had never felt more distant. She was not free. She never had been. From the moment the gods had decided her fate, she had been bound to this war, this cycle of violence, this endless loop of betrayal and loss. Even now, as she stood there, knowing the horse contained the doom of her people, she felt as though she were trapped by her past, by the gods, and by her own choices. But as Odysseus stepped closer, she saw something in his eyes, something that made her stomach turn. He was not just a man, he was the embodiment of a force far darker than anything she could have imagined. A force that had used her beauty, her love, her very soul as a weapon. And now, as the final battle loomed, she could see in his gaze that he, too, was merely another puppet in the hands of the gods, playing his role in this endless tragedy. Helen stepped back from the horse, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the end had come. There was no escaping the destruction that awaited Troy. No escaping the gods' cruelty. No escaping the truth of her life, the truth of the war that had been written in the stars long before she had ever laid eyes on Paris. And yet, as she turned away, she could not help but wonder, was there still a way for her to stop it? To undo the damage, to atone for the countless lives lost in her wake? But it was too late. The horse stood there, a silent sentinel to the end of Troy. The Greeks were ready, and tomorrow, the city would burn. And Helen, once the woman whose beauty had launched 1,000 ships, was now the woman whose decisions had sealed Troy's fate. The night had been filled with an eerie stillness, an unsettling quiet that had settled over Troy like a blanket of dread. The people, exhausted from years of war, had not noticed the faint sound of Greek soldiers emerging from the belly of the wooden horse. They had not heard the hushed orders whispered in the shadows. They had not heard the creaking of Troy's gates as they were opened by traitors within, those who had betrayed their own city for the promise of spoils, for the gleam of Greek gold. But Helen heard it. She felt it in her bones, in the hollow ache that had lived in her heart since the first day she had set foot in Troy. It was the sound of destiny, of the end. The gods, ever cruel, had chosen this night to seal her fate, to bring the city she had once loved to its knees. The Greeks flooded through the gates like a wave crashing against the shore. Their victory was assured. The siege had lasted for so long, but now, with the element of surprise on their side, there was no force in the world that could stop them. The Trojans, still reeling from the shock of the wooden horse, were caught unprepared. They had believed they had won. They had believed the Greeks had finally given up, leaving behind only a symbol of peace. They were wrong. Chaos erupted within the city. Screams echoed through the streets, mingling with the clatter of swords and shields. Fires began to spread, their orange glow casting long shadows on the crumbling walls. Helen, standing at the heart of it all, could hardly believe what she was seeing. She had been there, in the thick of the destruction, from the beginning. But now, as Troy burned, it was as though everything she had known had unraveled in an instant. The blood, the smoke, the devastation, it was all too much. She could not reconcile the beauty of the city she had once called home with the nightmare before her eyes. Her heart hammered in her chest as she ran through the streets, her footsteps echoing in the growing silence. What had she done? What had her beauty, her love, her betrayal, what had it all led to? This was not the love she had once dreamed of. Paris was gone, and with him, the man who had swept her away from Sparta. And now, as the ruins of Troy fell around her, she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret and a burning sense of guilt that threatened to consume her entirely. And then, she saw him. Through the smoke and the carnage, a figure appeared. Tall, proud, and unwavering in the face of the chaos surrounding him. It was Menelaus. His presence was like a jolt of electricity, a painful reminder of the life she had left behind, of the man she had betrayed. The man whose heart she had broken, whose world she had shattered, for the sake of love, for the sake of Paris. And now, as the walls of Troy crumbled, he was there. He was alive. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Helen stood frozen, staring at him across the battlefield. His armor, once shining, was tarnished from years of war, but there was no mistaking the man who had once been her husband. His gaze met hers, and in that instant, everything seemed to come rushing back. The love they had shared, the pain of separation, the years of waiting and wondering. But there was no joy in this reunion. There was no warm embrace. Only the grim recognition that everything had been shattered beyond repair. Menelaus had been a stranger to her for so long. A man she had once loved, yes, but a man who had become a shadow in her memory. She had abandoned him, and he had moved on, as people do. But now, as she stood before him, the weight of her betrayal pressed down on her like a suffocating force. She knew he had come for one thing, retribution. He had come to reclaim her, yes, but more than that, he had come to make sure that the price of Troy's fall would be paid. Helen, his voice was like gravel, harsh and unforgiving. He had no tenderness left in him, no softness. His eyes, once filled with love for her, now burned with anger and hurt. I never thought I would see you again. I never thought I would set foot in this cursed city. But here you are. Here we are. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to begin to apologize, to explain. There were no words that could undo what had been done. She had once been a queen, a woman with the world at her feet. But now, as she stood before Menelaus, she was nothing more than a shadow of that woman. A hollow version of the beauty that had once launched 1,000 ships. There was nothing left to her but the consequences of her choices. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had cried too many tears for Troy, for Paris, for herself. There were no more tears left. Only the emptiness of what was to come. Menelaus, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. I never wanted this. I never wanted any of it. I never meant for Troy to fall. I never wanted to hurt you. But he did not respond with anger, not right away. Instead, there was a silence between them, thick with years of hurt and regret. Then, with a strange calmness, he stepped closer, his eyes softening just a fraction. He took a breath, as though gathering his thoughts, and then, almost gently, he said, I know, Helen. I know. For a moment, they simply stood there, as the city burned around them, the sounds of destruction echoing in the distance. And in that brief, fleeting moment, Helen realized that the war had never been just about love or betrayal. It had never been just about Paris or Menelaus. It had always been about the gods, about forces beyond human understanding. The war was their game, their cruelty, and they had used her, as they had used so many others. Menelaus looked down at her, and for the first time in years, she saw something akin to pity in his eyes. It was not the pity of a man who had forgiven, but the pity of one who understood that no one, not even Helen of Troy, was immune to the will of the gods. Come with me, he said softly, though his voice held no warmth. Troy is lost. There is nothing here for you anymore. And in that moment, as the smoke rose into the night sky and the city crumbled to its inevitable end, Helen knew that Menelaus was right. There was nothing left for her in Troy. No home, no love, no future. The gods had claimed their prize, and now, like a broken toy, she would be returned to the man who had once called her his wife. She nodded silently, allowing him to lead her away from the ashes of Troy, away from the ghosts of her past. The city, the war, the beauty that had once defined her, all of it was behind her now. As they walked through the ruins of Troy, Helen could not shake the feeling that she was walking into a new kind of prison, one that would follow her for the rest of her life. The fall of Troy had not just claimed the city. It had claimed her, too. The smoke from Troy's smoldering ruins curled up into the night sky, an endless stream of darkness that seemed to reach into the heavens, as though seeking to claim the gods themselves. The cries of battle still echoed in the distance, but now it was quieter, eerily quiet. Amidst the chaos and destruction, Helen stood motionless, her heart heavy, as the last vestiges of her once beautiful city crumbled around her. Beside her, Menelaus walked in silence, his footsteps steady, purposeful, but filled with an emotion she could not name. Their eyes did not meet, there was no recognition between them. No warmth, no tenderness. Only the bitter remnants of what they had once shared, now shattered beyond repair. The air between them was thick with the weight of their past. She had once been his queen, the woman he had loved with all the intensity of his being. She had once been the promise of a life full of joy, a life full of dreams. But that woman, the woman who had abandoned him, who had followed Paris to Troy, leaving him to mourn for years, was gone. In her place stood a shadow, a woman broken by the war, by the gods, by her own choices. The woman who had launched 1,000 ships was now nothing more than a ghost of the past, and yet, even in her despair, she could not escape the feeling that her fate was still being decided by others. Menelaus had been quiet ever since they had met amidst the ashes of Troy. He had not yelled, had not raised his sword in anger, though Helen knew that he must have wanted to. She had betrayed him in ways that could never be undone. She had chosen Paris over him, had followed a love that had proven to be her downfall. How could he not feel rage, hatred, the burning desire for vengeance? Yet he said nothing. He didn't even look at her. The silence between them grew unbearable. It was a silence filled with the echoes of their shared history, filled with the weight of a love that had turned to ashes. A love that had once been pure, untainted by the gods' meddling, but now, all that remained was this painful, suffocating quiet. Finally, they reached a small clearing at the edge of the city, where the remnants of the Greek camp lay in wait. It was there that Menelaus stopped. He turned to face her, and for the first time, their eyes locked. Helen's breath caught in her throat. His gaze was cold, calculating, as though he were seeing her for the first time, as though he were deciding something far more important than her fate. For a moment, she felt exposed, as though every part of her had been stripped bare before him. The man who had once held her heart now looked at her with an emotion she could not decipher. Was it love? Or was it something else entirely? Menelaus spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of years of hurt. Helen. She had not heard her name spoken like that in so long. It was not with the softness of longing, nor the bitterness of anger. It was simply empty. Empty, like everything that had come before, like everything that had been lost. She swallowed hard, unsure of what to say, unsure if there was anything left to say. Menelaus, her voice trembled, but she could not help it. She had not seen him like this, so close, so far away. I never wanted this, none of this. I never wanted the war, the pain, the destruction. His eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tightening as if he were holding back the flood of emotions that had no outlet. You never wanted it? His voice cracked, though he quickly masked it. You never wanted it, Helen? Then why did you leave? Why did you follow him? Why did you make the choice that tore everything apart? Helen's breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of his words hitting her like a blow to the chest. She had no answers, no justification. She had acted on the whims of the gods, on the seductive promises of Paris, and now Troy had fallen. She had always thought that love could redeem her, that somehow her choices would make sense in the end. But now, standing before Menelaus, she realized that there was no redemption, no absolution for her sins. Her voice faltered. I thought I was in love. I thought I could escape. But I was wrong, Menelaus. I was wrong about everything. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze not softening, not forgiving, but not filled with the rage she had expected either. You were wrong, yes, he murmured, almost to himself. You were wrong about a lot of things. The silence stretched between them once more, heavier than any battle cry. The wind stirred the ash at their feet, and in that moment, Helen understood that there was no undoing the past. There was no undoing what had happened, no undoing the war, the destruction, the bloodshed. But there was still a choice to be made. Menelaus exhaled sharply, his shoulders tensing as if preparing for something. And then, with a decision that seemed to weigh more heavily on him than any battle, he spoke again. "I should kill you, Helen," he said, his voice low and filled with an unsettling calm. "For what you've done. For what you've caused. For the death of so many." Helen felt her heart shatter all over again. She had known this would come. She had known that her life would come to this point, the moment where Menelaus, finally face to face with the woman who had destroyed him, would have the power to take her life in an instant. She had prepared herself for this. She had prepared herself for the end. But what she had not prepared for was the silence that followed his words, the long, excruciating pause that felt like an eternity. Slowly, Menelaus lowered his sword. The decision was made. The sword remained at his side, not raised in anger, not drawn in wrath. He was not here for revenge. Not anymore. "You deserve death, Helen," he said softly, his voice full of regret, but there was something else there too, something she could not quite place. "But I won't give it to you. Not today. Not like this." Helen looked at him, her breath ragged, as though she were seeing him for the first time in years. He was no longer the man she had once known, and she was no longer the woman he had once loved. But even in the wreckage of their past, even in the ruins of everything they had once built, there was still something between them. Something that neither of them could name, but something that lingered in the air like a ghost. "I've lost everything, Menelaus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've lost Troy. I've lost Paris. And now, I've lost you." For the first time since their fateful reunion, Menelaus' eyes softened, though only slightly. "You lost me a long time ago, Helen. Long before Paris ever came into the picture. But I've come to understand that you were never truly mine to begin with. You were never truly anyone's." Helen felt a chill wash over her, but there was something almost freeing in his words. For all the pain, for all the hurt they had caused one another, it was over. The war was over. The gods had had their way. But she, at least, was still alive. And in that moment, alive was all she could be. Menelaus turned away, walking back toward the Greek camp, leaving Helen standing in the ashes of Troy. She knew that nothing would ever be the same. And yet, in his decision to spare her life, she realized something that, until then, she had never fully understood. Sometimes, the greatest punishment was not death. It was the living. The long voyage from Troy was a quiet one, marked by a steady, almost oppressive silence. The waves crashed against the ship's hull, each surge of water sounding like a relentless reminder of everything Helen had lost. The same sea that had once carried her to Troy now carried her back, but nothing felt familiar anymore. She had been a queen, a wife, a woman loved by men and gods alike. Now, she was nothing more than a shadow of those things, a memory that had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Helen stood at the bow of the ship, her gaze lost in the endless horizon, the sea stretching out before her like a vast, uncharted emptiness. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment, she could almost believe that the past was nothing but a dream. But the ache in her chest, the crushing weight of guilt, reminded her that it had all been real. Paris was gone. Troy was gone. And now, she was returning to a place she no longer recognized. As the shores of Sparta finally came into view, Helen felt a wave of dread rise within her. She had always thought that her home, her people, would be waiting for her with open arms. But how could they? How could they forgive her for what she had done? How could she forgive herself? The beauty that had once defined her, the allures that had once captivated a king, a prince, a city, now felt like a curse. It was as though the gods had twisted her very soul, leading her down a path of destruction, a path that had broken everyone she had touched. The ship docked in the harbor, and as the crew disembarked, Helen hesitated. Her feet felt heavy on the ground, as if the earth itself rejected her. She stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. This was Sparta. Her home. But was it still home? Would it ever feel like home again? A group of Spartan soldiers, their faces impassive, stood nearby, waiting to escort her back to the palace. Their eyes were cold, and their expressions betrayed nothing. Helen could not meet their gaze. She had once ruled this city, been adored by its people. Now, it was as if she were a stranger, a trespasser on her own land. As they made their way toward the palace, Helen's mind wandered back to the years of war, to the years spent in Troy. She had been a prisoner of her own desires, a prisoner of the gods' whims. And now, she was returning to a land that had seen her as a symbol of beauty, of power, of desire. But that was before. Before the fall of Troy. Before Paris. Before Menelaus had stood before her with cold eyes and a heart full of wounds. The palace loomed before her, its tall, stone walls as imposing as ever. She could feel the eyes of the people on her as she passed by, but they didn't look at her with admiration. No, they looked at her with pity, with judgment. She had been the cause of the war, the destruction, the deaths of so many. She had left her husband and her daughter, and for what? For a love that had crumbled like ash? For a man who was now dust? Inside the palace, everything was the same. The tapestries, the marble floors, the familiar scent of incense, everything that had once been a part of her life felt distant now, foreign. She was no longer the woman who had once been adored by the people of Sparta. She was the woman who had caused the death of thousands, the woman who had betrayed her king, her country, and her family. Her first night in the palace was sleepless. The echoes of her past haunted her, the memories of Troy, of Paris, of the war. She could hear the whispers of the gods, the mocking laughter of Zeus, the distant cries of the fallen. They followed her into her dreams, into her waking moments, until she felt suffocated by their presence. She wanted to forget, to shut out the pain, but there was no escape. The past would not release her, no matter how hard she tried. The next morning, when she finally emerged from her chamber, she was greeted by the familiar sight of her daughter, Hermione. The child who had once been a symbol of hope for Helen now stood before her, a young woman with wide eyes, eyes that had seen too much for her years. She looked at Helen with a mixture of uncertainty and something else, something darker, something filled with betrayal. "Helen," Hermione said quietly, her voice shaky but filled with a strength that made Helen's heart ache. "Mother." Helen's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time Hermione had called her that since she returned, the first time her daughter had addressed her without the cold distance that had filled their exchanges. But the words were empty, hollow. Hermione was no longer the little girl who had once idolized her. She had grown into a woman who had witnessed the destruction of her world, a woman who could not easily forget that her mother had abandoned her for a war that had never been hers to fight. "Hermione," Helen whispered, her voice breaking as she reached out to her daughter, her hand trembling. "I am so sorry. I don't know how to make it right. I don't know how to make any of this right." Hermione stepped back, her eyes flashing with the pain of years of abandonment. "You don't get to fix it, Mother. You don't get to make it right. You left us. You left me." The words hit Helen like a physical blow, and she staggered back as if struck. She had expected anger, expected resentment. But the words, the raw emotion in Hermione's voice, felt like they were tearing her apart from the inside. She had abandoned her daughter, her flesh and blood, for a dream that had turned to dust. She had left Hermione to grow up without a mother, without guidance, while she pursued a love that had destroyed everything. "I didn't mean to leave you," Helen whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you, Hermione. I never meant any of this." But Hermione shook her head, tears filling her eyes as she turned away. "It doesn't matter now. Nothing matters now." Helen watched as her daughter walked away, the door slamming shut behind her. The sound echoed in Helen's chest, a hollow, final sound that seemed to mark the end of something. The end of her family, of her place in the world. She was alone, truly alone for the first time in her life. In the days that followed, Helen struggled to find her place in Sparta once more. The people no longer looked at her with awe or admiration. They looked at her with disdain, with fear. The warriors who once had fought for her, who once had sailed to Troy in her name, now turned their backs. There were no songs sung in her honor, no praises whispered in the dark corners of the palace. She had become a figure of shame, of regret. The city, once her kingdom, now felt like a prison. The people who had once adored her now viewed her as a traitor, a symbol of the destruction that had come upon their lands. She had been the catalyst for their pain, the reason they had lost so much. And now, they did not want her here. In the quiet of her chambers, Helen would sometimes wonder if she had been better off staying in Troy, if the gods had not cursed her to return to a land that no longer wanted her. She had fought the gods, fought for love, fought for something she thought was real. But now, all she had left was the bitter taste of regret and a heart that was too broken to mend. As the days dragged on, Helen came to understand something. There would be no easy forgiveness. There would be no quick redemption. The war had taken everything from her, and returning to Sparta could not undo the past. She could never go back to the woman she had been. And Sparta would never be the home she remembered. The sun dipped low over the Spartan hills, casting long, sharp shadows across the city that once felt like home. For Helen, it was a reminder of how much had changed, how much had been lost. As the world around her moved forward, she felt herself standing still, frozen in time, trapped in the ruins of a war that had never truly ended for her. Each day felt like a battle against the ghosts of the past, ghosts of Troy, of Paris, of the war that had ravaged everything she had once known. And yet, amidst the wreckage of her life, Helen had to find a way to survive. She had no choice. It wasn't the grandiose beauty that once defined her, the mesmerizing gaze that had captivated so many hearts, that kept her going now. It wasn't the power she once wielded as queen or the allure of her presence that could command armies and stir passions. No, it was something simpler, something quieter, a mother's love for her children. Her children, the innocent victims of her choices, the silent witnesses to the storm she had unleashed. It was the days spent in the quiet solitude of her chamber, staring at the familiar walls of the palace, that gave her the time to reflect. She could still hear the cries of war, the screams of the dying, and in the stillness of the night, the memory of Paris haunted her. But she couldn't let it consume her. She couldn't let the war be all that defined her. The weight of her past was heavy, and it was a weight she had to carry every day. The people of Sparta no longer looked at her with admiration, but with pity, with disdain. She had been the spark that had set the world on fire, and now the ashes of that fire were all that remained. Yet, despite the scorn that met her at every turn, Helen remained in Sparta. She remained because she had nowhere else to go. And more than that, she remained because she had children to care for. The first time she saw Hermione after the war had ended was like a wound reopening. Her daughter had grown in the years that had passed since the fall of Troy, and the girl who had once run to her arms now walked with a coldness that chilled Helen to her core. Hermione was no longer the child who had clung to her mother's side. She had seen too much, felt too much pain, to be that innocent girl anymore. The abandonment, the betrayal, had shaped her into someone who was both distant and strong. Mother, Hermione had said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue, as though it didn't belong to them anymore. There was no warmth in her voice, only the quiet acceptance of a broken reality. You're back. But, it's not the same, is it? Helen's heart twisted at the words, at the coldness in her daughter's gaze. She had failed Hermione, had chosen Paris over her. How could she ever make it right? How could she possibly hope to mend the rift between them when the wound ran so deep? I'm sorry, Helen had whispered, unable to hold back the tears. I've hurt you, Hermione. I can't undo what I've done, but I'm here now. And I will stay. I'll stay for you. But Hermione had turned away, the distance between them palpable, and Helen had been left standing in the quiet of the palace, a mother who had failed to protect her child, who had failed to keep the promises she had made. Still, Helen didn't give up. She couldn't. For the sake of her children, she had to find a way to survive, to rebuild what had been shattered. It was not easy, not by any means. But every day, she fought for a semblance of peace, a fragile hope that perhaps, one day, things could heal. It wasn't just Hermione she had to face. Her son, Megapenthes, had grown as well. He was older now, and the hurt in his eyes was even more visible than in Hermione's. He had witnessed his mother's choices, the consequences of her actions. But unlike Hermione, who had become distant and cold, Megapenthes' pain manifested itself in anger and bitterness. He resented her for the war, for the betrayal, for everything. And though he never said it aloud, Helen knew that he blamed her for the death of his half-brother, who had fallen during the war. Megapenthes had always been a reminder of the life Helen had once had, before the war, before the gods intervened. He was the child she had with Menelaus after their marriage, the one who had brought them closer when everything else had seemed uncertain. But now, he too was a product of the war, a casualty of the chaos she had unwittingly caused. The tension in the palace was thick as Helen tried, desperately, to connect with her children. She tried to reach out, to show them that she loved them, that she regretted her actions, that she would do anything to make it right. But the more she tried, the more they pulled away. Hermione spent most of her time with her own thoughts, her own resentments, while Megapenthes buried himself in the duties of the kingdom, the responsibilities that came with being the son of a king. And Helen, though surrounded by people, felt more alone than she had ever been. The walls of the palace had once been her sanctuary, but now they felt like a prison, a reminder of everything she had lost, of everything she could never regain. But the days passed. Slowly, imperceptibly, things began to shift. It wasn't the grand gestures, the sweeping declarations of love and remorse, that healed the wounds in Helen's relationship with her children. It was the small moments. The quiet conversations, the shared silences, the times when Helen simply sat beside them, watching them grow into their own people. It wasn't easy to far from it. But it was a start. For Helen, the path forward was not one of grandeur or glory. There would be no redemption in the eyes of the people of Sparta, no victory to claim for herself. Her reputation had been forever tarnished by the war, and her name would forever be associated with betrayal and destruction. But for her children, for Hermione and Megapenthes, she would keep fighting. She would keep loving them, even when they didn't know how to love her back. And in the quiet moments, when the chaos of the world seemed to fade away, Helen found a flicker of peace, a flicker that reminded her that survival was not just about enduring the storms of life, but about learning to live with the aftermath. The war had taken so much from her, but it had also taught her something she could never have learned in the days of her youth, that survival was about finding strength in the rubble, in the pain, in the silence. And as she sat beside her children, watching the light fade from the sky, she realized that, despite everything, despite all the pain, she had found a way to survive. In the years following the fall of Troy, stories of Helen's fate diverged like the tributaries of a river, some flowing into realms of myth, others into the murky waters of uncertainty. Among these, one of the most intriguing and mysterious accounts revolved around her sojourn in Egypt. To some, this was a tale of her escape, to others, a tale of divine trickery, a phantom, a mere illusion of Helen, left in her place while the true Helen sailed to distant shores. The people of Sparta and Greece believed the Trojan War had ended in her return to Menelaus, yet some whispered of a different ending entirely. According to these myths, Helen had been carried away to Egypt long before the war reached its fiery climax, her disappearance concealed by the will of the gods themselves. The Phantom Helen tale was one that captured the imagination of all who heard it. In this version of events, while the Greeks continued to wage war against Troy, Helen had already been sent far away, out of the reach of mortal men. This was not the Helen who had caused the war with a single glance or the one whose beauty had ignited the rage of both Greeks and Trojans. This was a Helen who had been spirited away under mysterious circumstances, hidden from the eyes of the world. It was said that Helen, no longer able to bear the weight of the bloodshed her beauty had brought upon the world, had asked the gods for mercy, for escape. It was Apollo, some said, who had heard her pleas. a divine being who had always held a strange fascination for Helen. Apollo, in this version of the myth, had decided to protect her from the wrath of the Greeks. He made the decision to take her away and place her in a land far from Troy's burning wreckage, far from Menelaus and the grief she had caused. And so it was that a phantom, a perfect double of Helen, was created, an illusion of beauty that remained in Troy, an image so convincing that none could tell it apart from the real Helen. This phantom was placed in the palace of Priam, where Paris and the Trojans, who were too blinded by the goddess's allure, believed they still had the real Helen within their grasp. It was this image of Helen, this ghostly reflection of the real woman, that Paris and others saw when they looked upon her, and it was this illusion that continued to weave the tragic threads of the war. Meanwhile, the true Helen found herself in Egypt, far from the war, her existence a mystery to the world. She spent her days in the court of the Egyptian pharaoh, where she was hidden from the eyes of both the Greeks and the Trojans. Here, she was safe, though not free from the burden of guilt. The sands of Egypt, though distant from the chaos of Troy, were no refuge for a soul as heavy as hers. But in the royal palace, there was peace, there was protection, and there was time for reflection. According to some, it was not a simple case of escape. Helen, in this telling, had become a prisoner of sorts, trapped in the palace of Egypt, her beauty both a gift and a curse. The pharaoh, taken by her otherworldly appearance, kept her within his walls, enthralled by the goddess-like woman who seemed to hold a power that transcended even the mortal realm. But Helen's heart was not there. It remained in Troy, amidst the flames of the war and the people she had once loved and betrayed. Her absence from Troy, however, did not go unnoticed. The Greeks continued their war, blind to the truth, believing they were fighting for a woman who was still in the city of Troy. It was this misunderstanding that caused them to prolong the siege, to continue throwing soldiers into a battle that had already ended for the woman they fought for. The true Helen, meanwhile, remained a shadow of herself, walking the dusty halls of the Egyptian palace, no longer a queen, no longer the cause of the war, but simply a woman who had been lost to the tides of fate. But as the years passed, whispers began to surface. Word of the phantom Helen in Troy reached Egypt, and it was then that Menelaus, desperate and confused, began to suspect that he had been deceived. How could his wife have returned to him, when the city of Troy still held her captive in its heart? He had fought for her, bled for her, only to find that the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost, was not the woman who had once been his queen. The phantom, the illusion of Helen, had misled him. And in his heart, he knew the truth. Helen was alive, somewhere, far from the shores of Greece. Yet, Helen's true location remained a secret. Menelaus, after all, could not know that she was in Egypt. The gods had kept that part of the story hidden from mortal eyes, leaving only fragments of the truth to be pieced together by those who dared to listen to the whispers of the gods. Some stories claimed that it was only after the war had ended that Helen was returned to Menelaus, brought back from Egypt, her time in the land of the pharaohs finally coming to an end. Others spoke of a more tragic ending, where Helen, never to see her homeland again, remained forever in Egypt, a captive of her beauty and the gods' designs. Even the final fate of the phantom Helen was unclear. Some stories suggested that the illusion was shattered when the war reached its conclusion, revealing the truth to the Trojans and the Greeks. Yet, others believed that the phantom still haunted the ruins of Troy, an eternal reminder of the war and its senselessness, lingering like a forgotten dream. In these myths, Helen was neither a mere victim nor a heroine. She was a woman caught between two worlds, pulled in different directions by the gods who sought to shape her fate. Whether she lived in Egypt in exile or remained a symbol of tragedy in Troy, the question of who she truly was remained elusive. Was she a prisoner of the gods, a pawn in their games? Or had she chosen her fate, fleeing to Egypt to escape the destruction she had wrought, seeking peace in a foreign land? The Phantom Helen story, like so many others in her life, did not provide clear answers. But it offered a glimpse into the complexity of her soul, a soul torn between duty and desire, love and guilt, sacrifice and self-preservation. And in that ambiguity, perhaps lay the truest representation of Helen herself, a woman caught in the web of her own beauty, trapped between the gods and her own desires, forever wandering in the shadows of her past. In the years that followed the fall of Troy, Helen's life was marked by a quiet but profound struggle, one that was far more personal than anything the world had witnessed during the war. The scars of her past, both the visible and the invisible, gnawed at her soul, each day a reminder of the lives lost, the families torn apart, and the fires that had consumed an entire civilization in her name. The weight of her beauty, once a symbol of adoration, now felt like an unbearable burden, a curse, a stain on her existence. But through the anguish, a shift began. It was not the promise of divine forgiveness that drove her, for the gods had long turned their backs on her. It wasn't the hope of reconciliation with Menelaus or the return of her former glory. No, what haunted her now was the desperate need to find peace within herself, to atone for the immense suffering she had unknowingly caused. In the quiet moments, when the bustling life of Sparta would slow to a whisper, Helen would retreat into the shadows of her mind, where memories of war, death, and loss echoed in every corner. And in these moments, she realized that her path to redemption lay not in seeking forgiveness from men, or even from the gods, but in acts of charity and piety, and dedicating herself to a cause far greater than her own suffering. Helen's first steps toward atonement began in the small, humble acts of kindness she offered to those around her. These were not grand gestures for the public eye, but quiet, almost secretive deeds that sought no praise, only the satisfaction of knowing she was doing something to make amends. She began to visit the sick and the wounded, those whose bodies bore the scars of the war she had indirectly started. Many of them were not warriors, many of them were the innocent women, children, and elderly who had been caught in the aftermath of Troy's destruction. She would sit beside them, listening to their stories, offering what little comfort she could. She would hold their hands and whisper prayers to the gods, though she knew they were unlikely to hear her. She was, after all, no longer the radiant beauty whose name had echoed through the halls of Troy. She was a woman, broken and burdened by the weight of her past, who could only give what she had left, her time, her presence, and her empathy. But even in these moments, when her soul felt heavy with guilt, there was a quiet sense of peace that began to settle in her heart. She was no longer the cause of destruction, she was becoming a small source of healing in a world that had been torn apart. As time went on, Helen's acts of charity expanded. She sought to help those whose lives had been ravaged by the war, particularly the families of those who had perished. She would personally oversee the rebuilding of homes, using her influence as the Queen of Sparta to ensure that those who had lost everything were given a chance to start anew. She didn't simply oversee the work, she worked alongside the laborers, lifting bricks and hauling supplies, all the while hoping to redeem herself, hoping that in her sweat and toil, she could undo at least some of the damage her beauty had caused. Though many did not understand why Helen, once the most coveted woman in all of Greece, would choose to toil in such a humble way, those who witnessed it saw the sincerity in her actions. The people of Sparta, who had once been blinded by her beauty, began to see her in a different light, not as the woman who had once caused the death of their sons and fathers, but as a woman who had learned the true value of compassion and sacrifice. But it was not just in acts of charity that Helen sought to make amends. She also turned to the gods, seeking a way to cleanse her soul of the stain she carried. The gods had abandoned her in the aftermath of the war, but she did not give up on them. In her own way, she turned to the divine, praying for guidance, for strength, and for redemption. Helen made offerings at the temples, dedicating them not to herself, but to the souls of the fallen, those whose lives had been destroyed in the war. She offered gold, grain, and incense, hoping that her sacrifices, however small, might bring some comfort to the spirits that lingered, trapped between life and death. She even traveled to sacred sites, visiting shrines and oracles in search of divine favor. There, she would perform rituals, bowing before the gods in the hopes that her actions, no matter how insignificant, would help atone for the death and suffering her beauty had caused. There were many, especially in Sparta, who saw these acts as a sign of Helen's true remorse. Her charity was not merely an attempt to win back the love of Menelaus or the favor of the gods. It was an expression of a woman who had come to understand the cost of her beauty and the responsibility that came with it. Her soul was scarred by the knowledge of how deeply her allure had impacted the lives of so many, but through her acts of piety and charity, she sought a way to balance the scales of justice. Yet, not all were convinced. Some saw Helen's acts as nothing more than a desperate attempt to gain forgiveness, a way to make herself feel better after the devastation she had caused. There were whispers that she had only begun to act out of guilt, not true remorse. But for Helen, the opinions of others no longer mattered. She had learned that redemption was not something that could be earned in a single grand gesture or through the approval of others. It was something internal, something that could only be found within the quiet recesses of the soul. As the years passed, Helen continued her path toward redemption, though she knew she could never undo the past. The memories of Troy, the faces of the dead, would always haunt her. But as she watched children play in the streets of Sparta, as she held the hands of those who had suffered in the war, she began to feel the weight of her own soul lighten ever so slightly. She knew she could never completely erase the scars of her past, but in her humble acts, in her unspoken prayers, and in her selfless service to those around her, Helen found a small measure of peace. She had, perhaps, done more for her redemption than anyone could have imagined. For in the end, it was not the gods who would grant her forgiveness, nor the people who would choose to forgive her. It was Helen herself, through her love, her sacrifices, and her enduring humility, that brought herself back from the edge of despair and into the light of redemption. When Menelaus, the once proud king of Sparta, breathed his final breath, it was as if the earth itself had trembled in sorrow. For years, he had lived, not just as a king, but as a man haunted by the choices he had made, by the love of a woman who had torn apart everything he had once known. He had spent decades searching for peace, for a return to the home he had lost, and for a life free from the chains of war. But in the end, death claimed him, as it does with all things, quietly, without fanfare, and without the forgiveness he had perhaps longed for. Helen stood by his side in the final moments, her eyes empty, her heart hollow. He was her husband, the man who had been her partner, her king, the father of her children, yet she felt no overwhelming sorrow at his passing. Instead, there was a strange, distant emptiness that consumed her. She had loved him once, deeply, but love, after everything, had faded. Time had not been kind to either of them. She had spent years wrapped in her own web of guilt and remorse, distancing herself from the life they had once shared. As Menelaus lay in his final repose, Helen watched the way his once powerful frame had withered and shrunk. The king who had once led armies into the heart of Troy, who had commanded respect and fear, now looked like nothing more than a frail shell of the man he had been. There was no anger in her gaze, no lingering resentment, only a quiet resignation to the path life had carved for them. She thought of their years together, the war they had fought, the betrayal that had started everything, and she wondered, for the first time, if the life they had shared was simply an illusion, a fleeting moment in a long, unrelenting march toward death. She thought of the men and women whose lives had been shattered by their love, the families destroyed, the countless souls whose fates had been sealed by their union. And in that moment, as Menelaus' eyes slowly closed for the final time, she felt an odd sense of detachment from the world, as if she were a spectator in her own life. What did it matter now? The gods had abandoned her, the war had long since ended, and her beauty, once the very cause of the destruction, had faded with time. There was nothing left for her in this world. No redemption, no forgiveness that would ever fill the hollow emptiness inside her heart. Helen's reaction to Menelaus' death was not one of loud grief, nor was it one of relief. It was simply quiet acceptance. Her heart, once filled with passion, with love, and with longing, had turned to stone. How could it not? She had given up everything for a war that had not been hers to begin with, and in return, she had lost everything. Her youth, her family, her peace of mind, her happiness. And now, with Menelaus gone, the final tether to her former life was severed. She was free, free of the guilt that had weighed her down, free of the pain that had accompanied her every step for years. But in that freedom, there was no joy. In the days that followed Menelaus' death, Helen withdrew further from the world around her. She retreated into the palace, into the cold, empty halls that once echoed with laughter and warmth. The people of Sparta, who had once feared and adored her, now whispered behind closed doors, uncertain of what to make of the woman who had returned after Troy, only to fade into the shadows. No longer was she the beauty who had sparked wars, nor was she the queen who had stood by her husband's side. She was a ghost of the past, a fading memory, a woman who had seen too much, experienced too much, and whose soul had been irrevocably altered by it all. She no longer cared for the opinions of others. The honor of being queen meant nothing to her now. She had given everything she had to the gods, to Menelaus, to Troy, to the war, and it had all been in vain. Her days were filled with silence, and her nights with restless dreams of the past. There was no hope left for Helen, only a quiet, consuming weariness that she could not shake. The love she had once felt for Menelaus had evaporated over the years, replaced by something darker, something akin to pity, or perhaps even indifference. His death, while sorrowful in its inevitability, did not shatter her. It simply allowed her to finally feel nothing at all. As the seasons passed, Helen's detachment from the world deepened. The gods, once her constant companions, now seemed distant, their voices no longer reaching her ears. She had called upon them in the past, but they had remained silent, indifferent to her suffering. She no longer prayed. She no longer sought their guidance. Instead, she wandered the empty halls of her home, a queen without a kingdom, a woman without a purpose. The smiles of children, the laughter of the people, the warmth of family, these things no longer held meaning for her. What was life, when the gods had turned their backs on her, when her every action had led to destruction and despair? It was as if she had become untethered from the very fabric of mortal existence, drifting farther and farther away from the land of the living, as if the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead had grown thinner with every passing year. She felt no attachment to the fleeting pleasures of life, no longing for the beauty of the natural world, no desire to build something new, something better. Her beauty, which had once been a gift, a power, was now only a cruel reminder of the destruction it had caused. The world around her seemed empty, hollow, like a faded painting that had lost its vibrancy. Helen's soul, now fragile and broken, seemed to wander aimlessly through the years, detached from the very concept of living. There were moments, brief flashes, when memories of her past life, of Menelaus, of their children, of Sparta, would surge to the surface, but they were fleeting, gone as quickly as they had appeared. Her heart had been irrevocably shattered by the gods, and she could not find the strength to rebuild it. Menelaus had passed, and with him, any remaining ties to her past life had withered away. She no longer cried for him, no longer wished for his return. The grief she might have felt was swallowed by the quiet resignation that had taken root in her soul. The pain was gone, but so too was everything else. In the death of Menelaus, Helen had not only lost her husband, but the last fragments of the life she had once known. And in that loss, she felt the final shattering of the woman she had once been. There was no anger in her heart, no regret, only the quiet, steady march toward an existence she no longer understood. Helen had outlived her own story. And as she faded further from the world of the living, she was left with one lingering thought: perhaps this was how it was meant to be all along, an endless, drifting detachment from the world that had once celebrated her beauty, once adored her, but had ultimately cast her aside when it could no longer bear the weight of her existence. The passing of years, the crumbling of kingdoms, and the fading of ancient glories did little to erase the mark Helen left on the world. Though she had become a mere shadow of the woman she once was, her legacy, the story of her beauty, her choices, and the war they had sparked, continued to echo through the lives of those who came after her. Her influence, both destructive and profound, would shape the generations that followed, leaving them to grapple with the consequences of her actions, both as a cautionary tale and as a reflection of the beauty and power that could both create and destroy. Her children, the direct products of a union that had been forged by the whims of the gods, were bound by their mother's legacy in ways they could not escape. While Helen had grown detached from the world, her children still carried the weight of her name, her beauty, and the war that had torn apart the ancient world. They were the children of a mother whose face had launched 1,000 ships and whose choices had led to the fall of Troy, and that bloodline could never be ignored. It shaped their lives in ways both subtle and overwhelming. Her daughter, Hermione, perhaps felt the weight of her mother's legacy the most. Born into the shattered remnants of Troy's destruction, she grew up in the shadow of her mother's beauty, her mother's infamous reputation. It was as if the world had set an impossible standard for Hermione from the moment of her birth, an expectation that she would carry on the legacy of her mother, a legacy of power and allure, but also of pain, betrayal, and destruction. Hermione was raised in a world where love was a battlefield, where loyalty had been shattered, and where her mother's beauty had been both a blessing and a curse. As Hermione grew into adulthood, the same conflict that had plagued her mother began to plague her, though in different ways. She too was drawn into the politics of marriage, the weight of her bloodline burdening her with choices that were not her own. The world saw her, as they had seen Helen, through the lens of beauty, forgetting or overlooking her own desires and agency. Her marriage to Neoptolemus was another knot in the complex web of alliances and blood feuds that Helen's choices had set in motion. But for all the pain that Helen had endured through her relationships with men, her legacy also offered hope. The beauty that had once been the cause of endless conflict was now also the link between generations, something that would live on, even when its darker shadows loomed large. Helen's grandchildren, in particular, inherited her charm, her strength, and the tragic beauty that would forever mark their lives. Helen's influence did not stop with her immediate descendants. Her story was woven into the fabric of Greek mythology, passed down through oral traditions and epic tales. The gods, in their infinite complexity, ensured that the beauty and the drama of Helen's life would continue to reverberate through time. Her legacy became something that others could not ignore, even as they tried to escape it. One of the most striking features of Helen's legacy was the way her beauty, and the choices she had made, shaped the lives of her descendants. Beauty, in the world she had inhabited, was a double-edged sword. It was a weapon and a curse, a gift that could lead to adoration, but also to ruin. This power, this force of nature, passed down to her children and grandchildren, and with it came the knowledge that beauty could never be fully separated from the consequences of the decisions it inspired. The gods themselves had played their part in Helen's story, manipulating and toying with her, ensuring that her beauty and her choices would never be forgotten. And so, as each generation of her descendants rose to take their place in the world, they were reminded, whether by their own actions or by the stories told to them, that their lives, too, would be shaped by the same forces. In the stories of the Trojan War and its aftermath, Helen's name became a symbol of the complexities of fate, beauty, and choice. Her actions and the events that followed were recounted again and again, passed down through generations as both a cautionary tale and a reflection of the deeper currents of human nature. Her children and grandchildren could never fully escape the legacy she left behind, nor could they ignore the ways in which their own lives were influenced by her choices. Though Helen had sought redemption through her acts of charity and piety, the truth was that her legacy was inseparable from her past. It was a past defined by her beauty, by the war, by the choices she had made, and no amount of atonement could erase it. Her children, grandchildren, and those who followed them had to live with the consequences of that legacy, for better or worse. But in the end, Helen's legacy was not just one of beauty, pain, and destruction. It was also one of resilience, of survival. Her descendants, though weighed down by the past, found their own paths forward. Some sought to rise above the expectations that had been placed upon them, others leaned into the power of their lineage, using it to their advantage. Regardless of the choices they made, Helen's story lived on in them, guiding them in ways both subtle and profound. Her beauty may have launched 1,000 ships, but it was the choices of her descendants that would steer the course of history. As the years stretched on and the echoes of the Trojan War grew fainter, Helen, the woman whose beauty had shaped the very course of history, found herself caught in the mysterious web of the gods once more. Her mortal life, filled with triumphs, tragedies, and an endless pursuit of redemption, seemed to fade into the background as the divine realm began to stir around her. After everything she had endured, her abduction, the war, the loss of loved ones, and her subsequent life of regret and exile, Helen was finally granted the one thing that had eluded her for so long: immortality. The gods, ever so fickle and unpredictable, had watched Helen from a distance, intrigued by her beauty and the tumultuous life she had led. Zeus, in particular, had taken an interest in her, a man whose power and desires shaped the world itself. Some say that Zeus had long admired Helen from afar, enchanted by her otherworldly allure, and it was not mere chance that had drawn her into the chaos of the Trojan War. Perhaps it was destiny that led her to this point, or perhaps Zeus saw in Helen the reflection of the divine powers that ruled over the heavens and the earth. But whatever the reason, the moment arrived when Zeus, the father of gods and men, took Helen from the mortal realm and placed her among the stars. Her ascension, as told by myth, was as mysterious as it was divine. Some say that after her death, or perhaps before, no one can be sure, Helen was taken to the heavens by Hermes, the messenger god, guided through the winding paths between mortal life and the immortal world. In some versions of the tale, Helen was carried away in a golden chariot, her beauty lighting the skies as she left behind the world of pain, guilt, and regret. The bright stars twinkling above were said to be the reflection of Helen's beauty, immortalized for eternity. And what of Zeus? How did he play a part in Helen's transformation into a goddess? Some stories suggest that he had a hand in her final moments, guiding her toward her immortal fate. It was he who had sired her, after all, making her both the daughter of a mortal king and the child of the king of the gods. In that act of divine union, perhaps Zeus had sealed her fate as someone destined for something greater than a fleeting mortal life. Zeus' influence over Helen was undeniable. His will had shaped her journey from the moment she was born, when she had been the cause of the great oath sworn by the Greek princes, to the moment when she had been chosen to sail to Troy and spark the war that would change the world forever. Zeus, unlike the other gods who had tormented her with their manipulations and jealousy, saw Helen as a worthy subject for divinity. Perhaps it was his way of offering her the forgiveness and peace that had been absent from her life. He had turned his back on her in life, letting her face the harsh realities of the mortal world. But in death, or in her final moments on earth, he embraced her once more. He welcomed her into the divine fold, ensuring that Helen's name would live on not just in mortal tales, but as a part of the immortal pantheon. In the myths, the ascension of Helen was marked by a profound and dramatic shift. She was no longer the woman who had caused so much grief, nor was she the queen whose beauty had led to the ruin of a city. She became Helen the divine, her mortal failings washed away, replaced by the grace and power of the gods. She was now more than just a symbol of beauty, she was a symbol of redemption, of transformation, and of the complex relationship between mortals and immortals. It was as if the gods themselves had recognized the weight of Helen's life, and they offered her a final reprieve, a place among them in the heavens. But even in her apotheosis, there were whispers. There were those who wondered if Helen's ascension was truly a reward or a reminder of the chaotic power of her beauty. After all, she had been the source of so much strife, and her influence had stretched across the lives of mortals and gods alike. Was her immortality a sign of her ultimate forgiveness, or was it a reflection of the gods' own need to control and possess the very thing that had caused so much turmoil? The gods had the power to give and to take, to lift up and to tear down, and Helen, in her divine form, became yet another reminder of their capricious nature. Helen's ascension to divinity was not without its consequences. It left a trail of unanswered questions, of doubts about her true nature and the true meaning of her life. Some myths say that upon her arrival in the heavens, she was made to reside alongside the great heroes and gods in the afterlife, where she was united with the spirit of Paris, her lover and the man who had caused the war. They were said to live in eternal peace, free from the chaos that had once consumed their lives. It was as though their love, though tragic and fleeting in the mortal realm, had found a new purpose in the divine world. Yet other versions of the story speak of her reunion with Menelaus. In the afterlife, some say, she was reunited with her husband, the man she had once abandoned, the man whose trust she had shattered. In this version, it was not Paris but Menelaus who welcomed her into the realm of the gods. Their relationship, now purified by time and distance, was no longer one of betrayal and sorrow, but one of understanding and reconciliation. Perhaps this was the final step in Helen's redemption, the ultimate act of divine grace that allowed her to find peace after all the suffering she had caused. No matter which version of Helen's apotheosis one believes, it is clear that her story did not end with the fall of Troy. It did not end with her return to Sparta, nor did it end with the abandonment of her mortal life. Her beauty, her actions, and the consequences they had set in motion ensured that her legacy would stretch beyond the limits of time, reaching into the divine and eternal. Helen's ascension marked the moment when a mortal woman, once condemned by her choices, became a symbol of something far more transcendent, a goddess, free from the shackles of her past, and a part of the eternal cycle of myth and legend. Through Zeus' hand, Helen was granted immortality, but it was not just for her beauty. It was because she, like the gods themselves, was a creature of immense power, capable of creating both beauty and destruction in equal measure. Her ascension to divinity was a final acknowledgement of her role in the great tapestry of history, a reminder that even the most flawed and human among us can be elevated to something greater when the gods themselves see fit to intervene. After the chaos of her mortal life had faded away, Helen found herself in a place unlike any she had known, a realm untouched by the wars, the betrayals, the tragedies that had once consumed her existence. The Elysian Fields, the paradise where heroes and those favored by the gods resided for eternity, became her new home. Here, in this verdant and tranquil afterlife, Helen could finally find peace, free from the weight of her beauty, the guilt of her choices, and the endless drama of the mortal realm. The Elysian Fields, a land of eternal spring where the flowers never withered and the air was always warm, greeted her like a mother's embrace. It was a place where pain was forgotten, where the past could not touch her, and where the gods themselves no longer judged. The bright skies stretched endlessly above, and the rivers of the afterlife ran pure and clear, offering rest to those who had been weary in life. Here, no storms raged, no armies fought, no cities fell. It was an eternal sanctuary. As Helen settled into this peaceful world, the first person she encountered was Paris, the prince whose love had led to the fall of Troy. Their reunion was not one of violence, nor of the tragedy that had defined their lives in the mortal realm. It was a quiet, gentle moment. Paris, his face no longer marred by the weight of his actions, standing before her, just as she had last seen him. In the afterlife, there was no blame, no anger, no accusations. There was only the beauty of their love, now untouched by the bloodshed and suffering they had caused. Paris, who had once been driven by desire and selfish ambition, was now at peace, a far cry from the reckless youth who had stolen Helen from Menelaus. He looked at her with eyes full of the affection that had always burned brightly between them, but there was no longer any bitterness. Their love, though flawed and imperfect in life, had found its place here, in the tranquil fields of eternity. There, they could exist side by side, untouched by the mistakes of their past, and their reunion was filled with the quiet happiness of shared peace, a fleeting glimpse of the joy that had once been lost in the shadows of war. Yet, even in this paradise, Helen's past was never truly gone. The weight of her past choices followed her into the Elysian Fields, as did the presence of Menelaus, the king she had once betrayed. Her life had been one of beauty and love, but it had also been one of loss, and she could never forget the man who had stood by her, whose trust she had shattered. When Menelaus arrived in the Elysian Fields, Helen was unsure of how to face him. What words could she offer him after all the pain she had caused? How could she ever make amends for her part in the destruction of Troy and the anguish she had brought to his heart? To her surprise, Menelaus greeted her not with the anger and rage she had feared, but with quiet understanding. He had not come seeking vengeance, nor had he come to settle the score. In the afterlife, there was no need for further conflict. Instead, Menelaus embraced Helen, and in that embrace, all the years of sorrow, guilt, and distance seemed to melt away. The gods had granted them a reunion not of revenge, but of forgiveness. There, in the Elysian Fields, they were no longer bound by the mistakes of their mortal lives. There was only the peace of reconciliation and the unspoken understanding that what had happened in life could no longer define them in the afterlife. Their reunion was not a return to the passion that had once consumed them, but a deep and quiet acknowledgement of the love that had survived everything: war, betrayal, the destruction of Troy, and the endless turbulence of mortal existence. Now, in the Elysian Fields, there was only the presence of two souls who had once been torn apart by forces beyond their control, now bound together in eternal peace. Yet even in this place of rest, Helen's story did not end with Paris and Menelaus. There were others who, like her, had lived lives touched by both glory and tragedy. She met with the heroes and heroines of her time, many of whom had fallen in the conflict that had raged across the world. Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, they too had found their place in the Elysian fields, and they greeted her with a mix of admiration and sorrow. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes, was there, his once immense strength now tempered by the tranquility of the afterlife. He, who had died young and in the prime of his glory, who had fought for honor and glory, had found peace in the Elysian fields. He met Helen with a quiet reverence, understanding the complexity of her life and the role she had played in the war. There was no accusation in his eyes, no judgment in his voice, just a silent recognition that they had all been pawns in the larger game of fate. And though Helen could never escape the role she had played in the fall of Troy, she could find solace in knowing that, in the afterlife, she was no longer alone in her burden. The wise and cunning Odysseus, too, appeared before her. His journey had taken him far and wide, and though he had faced challenges of his own, he understood better than anyone the true weight of destiny. He did not look at Helen with disdain. Instead, his eyes were filled with the quiet wisdom of one who had seen the highs and lows of life, who had come to understand that the gods played with mortals like chess pieces. He, too, had been a player in the great game of fate, and he shared a quiet word with Helen, acknowledging the complexity of their lives and the twists of fate that had led them both to this place of rest. And so, in the Elysian fields, Helen found not just peace, but understanding. She had lived a life marked by beauty, love, betrayal, and war, and now, in this afterlife, she could finally be free of the judgment and pain that had plagued her. Her reunions with Paris and Menelaus were filled with quiet grace, and the others who came to her in the Elysian fields showed her that, in death, there was no more need for vengeance, no more need for conflict. In the end, the Elysian fields became a place of peace for Helen, a place where she could rest, surrounded by those whose lives, like hers, had been touched by the whims of gods and the fury of fate. In the afterlife, Helen was no longer the cause of destruction, but a symbol of the quiet peace that could follow even the greatest of storms. Helen's story, one of beauty, desire, and devastating consequences, reverberated through the centuries, her name becoming synonymous with the finest ideals of human longing and the darkest depths of human folly. She was not merely a queen or a princess, she became the epitome of beauty itself, the very image of what it meant to captivate and destroy with one's presence. Her life and its tragic aftermath cast a long shadow over art, literature, and culture, shaping the Greek world's understanding of love, war, and fate. As the centuries passed, Helen's story became the subject of countless works of art, each interpretation adding a layer to her legacy. Artists and poets alike were drawn to her, their brushes and pens capturing the complex nature of her character, the delicate balance between her divine beauty and the suffering it caused. In their works, she was immortalized not as a mere mortal woman but as a symbol of beauty's power to both elevate and ruin. The painters who stroked their brushes across canvas, the sculptors who shaped marble with expert hands, and the poets who wove her story into epic verse all had one thing in common: they sought to understand, and perhaps to interpret, the eternal tension that defined her existence. In literature, Helen became a figure of immense fascination, her beauty often portrayed as a gift and a curse, a divine trait that set the stage for her involvement in the events of the Trojan War. Poets like Homer immortalized her in their epics, with the Iliad presenting her as a woman caught between the love for her husband, Menelaus, and the irresistible pull of Paris. Yet, even within this story, she was never simply a passive character. The great epics saw Helen as a woman torn between desires, torn between conflicting allegiances, and ultimately, a woman who became an unwilling pawn in the hands of fate. In the Iliad, Helen is portrayed with a sense of tragic self-awareness. She knows the damage her beauty has caused, and her moments of reflection reveal a deep sadness. She sees herself not as the proud queen she once was, but as a woman trapped by her own allure, constantly reminding the warriors around her of the tragedy she has helped unfold. Her own words are filled with regret, yet she cannot escape the consequences of her actions, as if she is bound by some higher power beyond her control. This recognition of her tragic role in the war shaped how future generations saw her, not as a mere seductress, but as a woman ensnared by fate, trapped in the narrative the gods had written for her. In art, Helen's image became even more complex. Sculptures of her, such as the famous representations of her in both Greek and Roman art, capture her as a figure both ethereal and elusive, a perfect blend of divine beauty and human sorrow. Her face, whether rendered in marble or painted upon a vase, was depicted with delicate features, each curve and line emphasizing her otherworldly allure. Her eyes, often cast downward or away from the viewer, carried a sense of longing or melancholy, as if she, too, could not escape the fate that had been handed to her. And yet, despite this sadness, there was always the reminder of her power, her beauty, which had ignited a war and shaped the future of civilizations, was an undeniable force. The tragic beauty of Helen became a central theme in the art of ancient Greece, embodying the ideal of the tragic hero. She was not just the beautiful woman who launched 1,000 ships, she was the one who bore the heavy burden of being both adored and despised. In her, the Greeks saw the frailty of human existence, how a single flaw, a single moment of desire, could ripple out to change the course of history forever. Comparisons to other mythological figures only served to deepen Helen's mystique. She was often compared to other figures who represented the pinnacle of beauty and desire, most notably Aphrodite, the goddess of love herself. Aphrodite, who had played a crucial role in causing Helen's abduction by Paris, was often seen as a mirror to Helen's own beauty. While Aphrodite's power was one of divine control over love and desire, Helen's beauty was mortal, yet no less potent. It was a beauty that could move men to madness, to war, and to ruin, a beauty that belonged to her as much as it belonged to the gods. Where Aphrodite's allure was playful and seductive, Helen's was tragic and inevitable. The very idea of beauty that could destroy was a theme explored time and time again in Greek literature, and Helen stood as its greatest example. Another comparison was often made to Pandora, the first woman created by the gods, who, like Helen, was a symbol of divine beauty and the source of immense suffering. Pandora's box, which contained all the evils of the world, was a gift from the gods, one that, once opened, could not be undone. Like Pandora, Helen was both a gift and a curse. Her beauty, bestowed upon her by the gods, was both a blessing and a disaster. Both women were trapped by the power of their beauty and the actions it inspired, though Helen's beauty was not something that could be sealed away or contained. It was a force that consumed both her and the world around her. Helen also drew comparisons to the tragic figure of Medea, another powerful woman in Greek mythology whose love and vengeance led to devastating consequences. Like Helen, Medea was a woman caught between love, betrayal, and the consequences of her own decisions. Both women had been the cause of suffering and destruction, and both were often seen as symbols of the darker aspects of love. However, while Medea took direct action to punish those who wronged her, Helen's role in the war was more passive. Her beauty, however, was enough to ignite the flames of war, making her a figure of tragedy in a different sense. She was the one who did not act, but was acted upon. In the centuries that followed the fall of Troy, the image of Helen would become more than just a tale of a woman and a war. She became a symbol of the human condition itself, the interplay of beauty, desire, fate, and consequence. The poet Ovid, writing in the Roman Empire, would later muse on Helen's beauty in his Heroids, where the figure of Helen is depicted as both a victim and a villain, embodying the complex emotions that come with unfulfilled love, regret, and the inevitability of fate. She was both the object of longing and the cause of destruction, a paradox that intrigued and captivated writers and artists for centuries. Helen's legacy was cemented not only as a character in Greek myth, but as an eternal muse, one whose beauty transcended time and whose tragedy was immortalized in every stroke of an artist's brush and every line of poetry. She was a reflection of the dangers of love, the allure of desire, and the inevitable consequences that followed when mortals sought to play with forces beyond their understanding. As a symbol of beauty and tragedy, Helen's story became an indelible part of the human imagination, one that continues to be revisited in countless forms, always reminding us of the fine line between adoration and destruction. Helen of Troy, the woman whose beauty launched 1,000 ships and whose actions triggered one of the most devastating wars in mythological history, has not only survived through the centuries but has evolved into a multifaceted symbol in modern culture. Once the epitome of passive beauty and destructive desire, she is now seen in a variety of ways, sometimes as a tragic figure, sometimes as an independent woman caught in the grip of forces beyond her control, and sometimes as a feminist icon reclaiming agency in her own narrative. In the ancient myths, Helen was often depicted as little more than a passive object of desire. She was a beautiful woman whose allure could spark wars and whose loyalty was torn between a husband and a lover. Yet, her role in the narrative was always framed by the choices of men. Paris abducted her, Menelaus fought for her return, and the gods manipulated her fate. For centuries, Helen was seen primarily as a catalyst, an unwitting instigator of tragedy, defined by her beauty rather than her actions. However, as society's views of women and their roles in both mythology and life began to shift, so too did interpretations of Helen. Modern readings of Helen have reflected broader changes in feminist thought, which has re-examined her character through the lens of power, agency, and autonomy. One of the most significant changes in Helen's modern reinterpretation is the reclaiming of her narrative from one of passivity to one of complexity. Modern writers and thinkers have stopped viewing her as a mere object of desire and have instead begun to ask, what if Helen had more control over her fate than was once believed? What if, rather than being a victim of the gods and men, Helen made choices that were her own? Writers like Euripides in the ancient world gave Helen a voice through tragedy and myth, but in contemporary works, the conversation has evolved to portray her as a woman making difficult decisions, sometimes with agency, even when trapped by circumstances beyond her control. This shift has been particularly striking in the way modern literature explores Helen's own emotions and internal conflicts. In novels like Margaret George's Helen of Troy and Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles, Helen is no longer just a passive player in a male-dominated myth. She is given a voice, a personality, and a depth that wasn't available to her in earlier versions of her story. In these retellings, Helen is portrayed as a woman caught between different desires and competing responsibilities, and though her beauty remains a central theme, her inner life is just as significant. These interpretations give Helen a sense of autonomy and complexity, and in doing so, the narrative elevates her from an object of men's desires to a multifaceted, fully realized character who is as much a victim of the war as she is an agent within it. Helen's evolving identity also connects to the rise of feminist thought in modern culture. In the past, beauty often equated to powerlessness for women, especially in myths and literature, where women's worth was often defined by their appearance or their relationships to men. Helen, however, has come to represent the complicated intersection between beauty, power, and destruction. As scholars, writers, and artists began to challenge traditional gender roles, Helen's character was re-examined through the lens of modern feminism. Far from being a mere pawn in a game of gods and men, she has become a symbol of the ways in which beauty can be both a blessing and a curse, an embodiment of the complex ways in which women navigate societal expectations of appearance, power, and control. In some contemporary reinterpretations, Helen's beauty is no longer viewed with the same reverence it once was. Rather, it is understood as a double-edged sword, something that both grants her immense power but also causes her suffering. For example, in some feminist readings of Helen, her beauty becomes a metaphor for the way society often reduces women to their looks, overlooking their intelligence, capability, and humanity. Helen's beauty, in this light, is both a gift and a trap, a form of entrapment that society imposes upon her. Her beauty commands the attention of powerful men and gods, but it also leads to her manipulation and ultimately to the tragedy of Troy. Her evolving image in modern thought can be seen as a commentary on how society's fixation on women's appearance often renders them vulnerable, and the pressure to conform to this ideal can lead to both personal and societal destruction. Additionally, Helen's position as a feminist icon is enriched by her growing sense of autonomy in contemporary retellings. Far from the passive victim of love and betrayal, many modern adaptations focus on Helen's own desires, agency, and how she navigates her place in a male-dominated world. In novels, plays, and films, Helen is no longer a woman who only reacts to the actions of men. Instead, she is portrayed as a woman who shapes her own destiny. In some modern works, Helen is not simply the beautiful woman at the heart of the Trojan War, but also a symbol of resistance, resisting the roles that society, the gods, and even love try to impose upon her. In some retellings, Helen is portrayed as a more complex figure, struggling with the consequences of her choices, but also asserting herself in a way that was not possible in ancient narratives. Helen may still find herself caught in a war between men, but she is increasingly presented as someone who at least partially owns her role in the war. Some modern interpretations suggest that, although Helen's beauty was the catalyst for the war, it was also the basis for her own power, one she could manipulate for her own benefit. In this way, Helen is transformed from a mere pawn in the hands of the gods and men into a player who recognizes the complexity of her own desires and actions. Helen's feminist evolution in modern eyes has also seen her become a symbol of the complexity of female power. She is no longer solely the representation of male desire, but a figure through whom the intricacies of love, choice, power, and agency are explored. Her evolution reflects an ongoing conversation about women's roles in history, literature, and society, how they have often been written out of their own stories, and how they can reclaim them. Helen's evolution as a feminist icon is also apparent in her portrayal in modern pop culture. In films, TV shows, and novels, Helen is increasingly being cast not as a helpless victim but as a woman who owns her own story, her own beauty, and the consequences of her actions. She is shown as a survivor of war, a woman who has suffered but continues to exist in the face of adversity. She is no longer just the face of the Trojan War, but a symbol of a woman who has been reduced, yet has the strength to rise above and reclaim her narrative. In the 21st century, Helen has gone from being a tragic figure trapped in the myth of beauty and betrayal to a multifaceted character who symbolizes the empowerment of women, the complexity of identity, and the freedom to make choices, even within the boundaries of a harsh, male-dominated world. Her legacy continues to evolve, reflecting the changing roles of women in society, and in modern interpretations, she is both an icon of the past and a symbol of resilience and autonomy for the future. Helen of Troy, the woman whose beauty transcended time and whose choices shaped the fate of nations, remains one of the most enigmatic figures in all of mythology. Though her story has been told and retold for millennia, it is one that resists a singular interpretation. She stands as both a victim and a perpetrator, a symbol of beauty and the destruction it can bring, a woman whose life was determined by forces beyond her control, yet one who never fully relinquished her agency. Zeus' most beautiful daughter, born of divine ambition and mortal consequence, exists as a paradox, a figure both real and unreal, her legacy haunting the world long after the dust of Troy settled. Throughout her myth, Helen is caught in the relentless pull of the gods, her beauty both a gift and a curse. She is a living symbol of the ways in which beauty can shape the lives of those who possess it and those who behold it. From her birth, when the gods quarreled over her, to her marriage to Menelaus, her abduction by Paris, and the wars that followed, Helen's life was never her own. It was as if the very fabric of her existence was woven into the designs of the gods. The judgment of Paris set her life on an irreversible course, and throughout the Trojan War, she remained a figure both coveted and reviled, a reflection of both divine intervention and human folly. Yet, despite the tumult surrounding her, she also displayed an inner strength, navigating a world that constantly sought to control her. Whether in her regrets, her moments of reflection, or her ultimate decisions, Helen was never entirely passive. Her story is a tragedy in the truest sense, filled with love, loss, betrayal, and the painful consequences of choices made. The gods, who shaped her life, remain distant, leaving Helen to grapple with the wreckage they've left in their wake. They played their games, manipulating her, bending her to their wills, and in doing so, cast her as the object of war, yet never allowed her the full agency to shape her own fate. This leaves us with the haunting question, was Helen merely a pawn in the divine chess game, or did she have more control over her destiny than we realize? There are moments when we see her anguish, her deep sense of guilt for the destruction wrought by her beauty, moments when she questions the choices that led her to Troy. Her regret is palpable, especially in the aftermath of the war, where she must come to terms with the thousands of lives lost because of her. In these reflections, Helen seems to move beyond the passive figure that the ancient myths often present her as. She becomes more than just the face that launched 1,000 ships. She is a woman who faces the weight of her actions and struggles to reconcile herself with her role in the tragedy of Troy. Yet even as we view her with sympathy, there is the undeniable fact that Helen's beauty remains her ultimate weapon, one she cannot escape, and one that, in the end, defines her place in the world. Beauty, in the ancient world, was both a gift and a curse, something that could elevate one to godlike status, but also condemn one to suffer. Helen's beauty is the catalyst for both love and war, and this duality follows her throughout her life, culminating in her return to Sparta. There, in the aftermath of Troy, she faces her husband, Menelaus, who, despite everything, chooses to forgive her, offering her a glimpse of redemption. But can beauty that has caused such destruction ever truly be redeemed? Perhaps the most enduring mystery of Helen's legacy is how she continues to captivate us. She is a woman caught between the divine and the mortal, between love and war, between regret and defiance. Her life was marked by loss and sacrifice, but also by moments of quiet strength and reflection. In the centuries since Troy fell, she has become an iconic figure, her beauty immortalized in art and literature, but also her tragedy, a reminder of the consequences of desire and ambition. Her story is one of extremes, the extremes of love, beauty, and betrayal, and the extremes of human suffering. We are drawn to Helen not just for her beauty, but for the depth of emotion and the complexity of the forces that shaped her. Even in her afterlife, the myth of Helen continues to evolve. In some versions, she is granted a peaceful and divine existence in the Elysian fields, where she is reunited with those she loved and lost. In others, her legacy continues to haunt the world, her beauty forever remembered as the spark that ignited the flames of Troy. Her image is ever-changing, from the tragic woman of war to the symbol of a woman who outlived the destruction she caused, finding solace and peace in the end. As we look back on Helen's life, we cannot help but feel a sense of awe at her complexity. She was more than a simple figure of beauty. She was a woman caught in the tides of fate, who made choices that would reverberate across the ages. She embodies the eternal struggle between the divine and the human, the ways in which the gods shape our lives, and the ways in which we, as mortals, must live with the consequences of their whims. The untold story of Helen is one that will never be fully understood. She will always be a figure caught between worlds, the world of gods and mortals, of beauty and destruction, of love and war. The question of her true nature, whether she was a victim of the gods, a woman who chose her path, or something in between, will continue to haunt us. And perhaps that is her greatest legacy, the enduring mystery of Zeus' most beautiful daughter, whose beauty, love, and tragic fate will forever echo through the annals of mythology.